Deep within the world's most remote and storied national parks, familiar paths twist into the unknown, and landscapes that appear ordinary conceal riddles that have puzzled observers for decades. From the jagged ridges of Yosemite to the dense alpine forests of the Pyrenees, people have vanished without a trace, leaving behind questions that defy logic, evidence, and expectation. These are not accidents lost to the passage of time, nor misadventures easily explained. They are disappearances that challenge our understanding of the wilderness itself. Imagine moving silently through meadows where sunlight strikes granite like molten metal, tracing footprints that vanish in snowfields, or listening to the forest for sounds that never return. Abandoned campsites and disrupted wildlife hint at stories never fully told, and the land seems to hold its secrets deliberately. Step closer to the edges of these mysteries, and the silence left by those who vanished becomes a presence in itself, pressing against every familiar boundary. The vanishing at Yosemite's Sunrise High Sierra Camp. High in Yosemite National Park, where granite domes catch the morning light and thin air carry sound in strange ways, sunrise. High Sierra Camp sits along a corridor travelled for generations by hikers, climbers, and guided groups. The area is considered remote but not isolated, a place defined by open meadows, well-known trails, and predictable summer movement. It was here, in July of 1981, that one of Yosemite's most enduring disappearances unfolded, a case that continues to unsettle investigators because it occurred in daylight, among other people, and within a landscape that had been carefully observed for decades. Stacy Ann Arras was 14 years old when she joined a group horseback trip through Yosemite's backcountry, organised by a reputable outfitter and routed between established High Sierra camps. On July 17th, the group stopped near Sunrise High Sierra Camp, an area familiar to park staff and routinely used as a rest point. Witnesses later recalled that Stacy stepped away from the group to rest on a log, remaining in clear view of the surrounding meadow. Within minutes she was gone, without a sound, without visible signs of distress, and without any indication of the direction she had taken. What troubled search coordinators almost immediately was the lack of a clear point of departure. Stacy had not wandered off a trail, crossed a river, or entered thick forest, and the meadow where she was last seen offered wide sightlines in nearly every direction. The ground showed no disturbed soil, no broken vegetation, and no footprints leading away from the resting area, despite dry summer conditions that typically preserve tracks. For a disappearance to occur so quickly in such open terrain defied the expectations of even seasoned Yosemite rangers. Another detail that continued to trouble those familiar with the case was how little the environment itself seemed to participate in the disappearance. In many wilderness incidents, terrain leaves some mark, whether through displaced stones, bent grass, or signs of hurried movement, yet the Sunrise Meadow remained undisturbed. Searchers later described the scene as unnervingly intact, as if the moment Stacy vanished had been carefully preserved. The stillness of the area stood in contrast to the urgency of the response, reinforcing the sense that something had occurred outside the patterns normally associated with lost hikers. A large-scale search effort was launched within hours, eventually involving hundreds of volunteers, park rangers, mounted units, helicopters, and search dogs. Over the following days, teams combed the Sunrise area surrounding drainages and nearby ridgelines, expanding outward in widening arcs. Dogs reportedly showed limited interest and failed to establish a sustained scent trail, a result that search professionals later described as unusual given the short time between disappearance and deployment. No clothing, equipment, or personal items belonging to Stacy were ever recovered. As days passed, the search extended into more hazardous terrain, including steep slopes and densely wooded sections of the Cathedral Range. Yet the results remained the same. There were no signs of a fall, no evidence of animal involvement, and no indication that Stacy had attempted to travel any distance on her own. Officials noted that the area did not contain abandoned mine shafts, known caves, or sudden drop-offs near the meadow, eliminating several common explanations often considered in wilderness disappearances. The case drew national attention, in part because of Stacy's age and the apparent safety of the location where she vanished. Yosemite National Park had experienced missing persons cases before, but rarely one involving a child disappearing in daylight near a staffed camp while accompanied by a supervised group. Despite the scale of the effort, the search was eventually scaled back and then formally suspended, with park officials stating that no credible leads remained to pursue. In the years that followed, questions lingered about certain aspects of the response. Some searchers later recalled discrepancies in early reports regarding the precise timeline of events, including how long Stacy had been out of sight before her absence was noticed. Others noted that the initial focus area shifted more than once, without a clear public explanation, complicating later attempts to reconstruct the search logic. While no official cover-up was ever acknowledged, the lack of detailed records released to the public fueled speculation rather than resolution. Yosemite's geography has often been cited as an explanation for disappearances, yet the Sunrise case resists easy categorization. Unlike incidents involving sudden storms, swift water, or technical climbing routes, Stacy's disappearance occurred under stable weather conditions, on gently sloping terrain during a routine stop. Investigators could not point to hypothermia, altitude sickness, or navigational error, factors commonly used to explain wilderness fatalities. The absence of physical evidence left every theory incomplete. Over time, the case became a reference point in discussions about unexplained disappearances in national parks, particularly those involving young individuals and group settings. Stacy Arras was never found, and no confirmed sightings or recoveries have surfaced in the decades since. Her name remains etched into Yosemite's quiet record of unresolved cases, one that continues to trouble those who understand how rare it is for someone to vanish without a trace in a place so carefully watched. Even now, hikers passing through Sunrise High Sierra Camp often remain unaware that a disappearance occurred there at all, despite the meadow's calm appearance and well-worn trails. The land gives no indication that anything extraordinary happened, yet the unanswered questions persist, suspended between official conclusions and the silence of the terrain. In a park defined by permanence and preservation, the absence left behind by a single afternoon in 1981 has never been filled. Somewhere between the open meadow and the surrounding granite, something interrupted the ordinary flow of that day, and whatever it was left no evidence behind to explain where Stacy Arras went, when Yosemite simply let her disappear. The Great Smoky Mountains boy who reappeared changed. Mist settles differently in the Great Smoky Mountains, folding the forest inward so that even familiar trails can vanish from sight within a few dozen steps, and distant voices echo strangely through dense stands of oak and hemlock. Fog drifts along ridgelines, compressing space and concealing both terrain and traveller. It was within this tangled, slow-moving landscape that a young boy disappeared during a routine family hike, an event that immediately unsettled rangers familiar with the park's backcountry. His absence did not fit the patterns of typical temporary separations, yet, for a brief period, no one could explain where he had gone. Families who explore these trails quickly learn that the forest can conceal movement with ease. Narrow footpaths wind unpredictably among thickets, moss-covered rocks, and fallen logs, creating shadows and visual obstructions that make even short distances disorienting. On that summer day, the boy walked close to his parents, yet the forest's layout allowed him to slip from view almost instantly. The dense vegetation, combined with the rolling hills and frequent low-hanging fog, produced an environment in which a child could move a surprising distance without detection, a reality that compounded the anxiety once his absence was realized. When the search began, it became clear how challenging the mountains were to navigate efficiently. Park rangers, volunteers, and family members spread through intersecting trails and uneven terrain, often unknowingly covering the same areas multiple times while leaving gaps elsewhere. The dense underbrush slowed movement, obscured visual markers and muffled sound, while helicopters struggled to penetrate the canopy with only brief glimpses of the forest floor. Coordination relied on limited maps, radios with patchy reception, and volunteers unfamiliar with the steep ridges, all contributing to a sense that the search itself was being absorbed and distorted by the landscape. Time in these mountains can behave unpredictably. The combination of shifting light, fog, and uneven terrain makes it difficult to anchor events chronologically. Initial estimates of how long the boy had been missing were necessarily broad, leaving gaps that were never fully reconciled. Observers reported that minutes felt longer and hours shorter, as search teams advanced through corridors of trees that seemed to swallow both sound and sight. By nightfall, uncertainty dominated the search, and what had begun as a straightforward effort transformed into a race against both darkness and the forest's natural capacity for concealment. The boy was eventually located alive, yet the circumstances of his recovery only deepened the sense of mystery. He was found in a section of forest that search teams had already combed, near terrain that seemed improbable for an unassisted movement by a child of his age. No clear path led from the point of separation to his location, and the physical evidence in the area did not explain it. Observers described the scene as perplexing, noting that it was impossible to reconcile the boy's position with the hours he'd been missing and the conditions through which he would have had to travel. Those examining the boy found details that resisted simple interpretation. His clothing was damp but not torn or dirt-stained, in ways consistent with long movement through brush. His shoes showed wear consistent with normal walking but not extended running or climbing over steep slopes. He appeared alert and coherent, with no visible injuries, dehydration, or signs of exposure that might account for an extended period lost in the forest. Each of these observations added clarity to one question, while simultaneously raising another, highlighting the gap between expectation and reality. When asked to recount his experience, the boy provided fragments rather than a full narrative. He remembered certain sounds, sensations, and landmarks clearly, but other spans of time were missing entirely from his account. He spoke of shadows, light, and a sense of movement, yet could not explain how he'd crossed hills and trails that would have taken hours to traverse. These selective recollections underscored a strange interplay between memory and geography, leaving investigators with details that were factual yet incomplete, evidence of an experience that had occurred somewhere beyond ordinary understanding. Officials explained that consistent with common circumstances in wilderness recoveries, they emphasized the resilience of children, the capacity for self-navigation, and the forgiving nature of the forest terrain, suggesting that he'd found a way to survive while moving without clear direction. These assessments were framed in neutral terms, supported by documentation of prior recoveries in the park, and included standard safety guidance. However, even with the official narrative in place, gaps in timing, distance travelled, and the boy's account remained unexplained, allowing uncertainty to persist alongside the recorded facts. Within the wider history of the Great Smoky Mountains, this incident stands out because it concludes without resolving the underlying questions. While the child returned safely, the disappearance did not fit patterns, and the forest left no tangible clues to reconstruct his movements. Unlike incidents in which search teams find physical evidence or clear indicators of travel, the absence of such markers in this case rendered understanding impossible. The event continues to be cited in discussions of park disappearances, not for the tragedy it could have been, but for the strange intersection of survival and unanswered questions it created. Long after the search concluded, the forest resumed its usual rhythms, yet the memory of the boy's absence persisted among rangers and families familiar with the case. Visitors still walk the same trails unaware of the brief disruption in the landscape, while investigators continue to study the event as a rare example of return without explanation. The mountains themselves remain unchanged, indifferent to the questions humans continue to ask, preserving the subtle sense that something in the forest exists just beyond comprehension. The boy emerged from the Great Smoky Mountains alive, yet the path that carried him back never fully intersected with the explanations meant to account for it. Lake Baikal's silent shoreline disappearance. Morning light slips across Lake Baikal's glassy surface, turning the water into a mirror that seems to stretch endlessly toward the horizon, where sky and lake blend into a single unbroken expanse. The shoreline is deceptively calm, revealing little of the cold currents beneath or the steep drop-offs that lurk just below the surface. On this day, a young hiker and amateur naturalist set out along the gravel-strewn banks, following a route frequented by locals and seasonal visitors alike. What began as a routine walk quickly became a mystery, as the person vanished without warning, leaving companions stunned and searching for explanations that the lake itself seemed unwilling to offer. On the shoreline, a solitary figure walked along the gravel-strewn edge, their footsteps leaving temporary impressions that would vanish with the next gust of wind or ripple of water. Witnesses later recounted that the individual paused frequently, examining driftwood, peering into shallows, and noting geological formations that line the lake. At one point, they stepped slightly off the main trail to inspect a shallow inlet, still within view of their companions. Minutes later, those nearby realized the figure was gone. No call for help had been made, and no disturbance of the surrounding area suggested an accident or struggle. Mist rises from the lake in curling waves, weaving through the stunted pine and larch trees that line the banks, muting sound and making even familiar paths seem foreign. The fog thickened as searchers moved forward, erasing visual cues and disorienting even those familiar with the terrain. Small ripples on the water's surface reflected the grey sky, and shadows shifted with the wind, creating an impression that objects appeared and disappeared at random. The environment seemed to resist clarity, absorbing every step, every voice, every attempt at locating the missing hiker, leaving a sense that the lake itself had swallowed them into its immense expanse. The first alerts came from companions who noticed a sudden absence, prompting a search that stretched along kilometres of shoreline, hampered by uneven terrain, patches of ice, and the sheer scale of the lake. Local rangers were contacted, and boats were deployed in an attempt to scan shallow waters, while ground teams combed the banks for tracks or signs of movement. Visibility was limited, and despite careful coordination, the search quickly became a struggle against both geography and perception. Even the most experienced guides noted that in such conditions, a person could disappear within seconds, leaving no trace behind. Investigators combed the area meticulously, yet the shoreline revealed almost nothing. No dragged debris, no disturbed rocks, and no evidence to indicate whether the missing person had entered the water or disappeared inland. Rocks remained in place. Small pools of meltwater were undisturbed, and vegetation along the edge bore no marks of struggle. Items commonly carried by hikers, backpacks, notebooks, or walking sticks, were absent. The absence of physical indicators left searchers with only impressions, the impression of movement without explanation, and a growing awareness that the lake could conceal events in ways that traditional investigative techniques could not overcome. Time itself became a puzzle, with discrepancies between reported last sightings, weather changes, and the appearance of shifting fog that could have hidden movement in seconds. Companions' recollections varied, some insisting only moments had passed, others estimating several minutes between last sighting and realization. The fog thickened, the wind shifted, and sunlight played across the rippling water in ways that obscured distance. Each attempt to anchor the timeline against objective measures, maps, GPS, and the known walking speed of the individual, produced contradictions that frustrated both investigators and companions, leaving a sense that the lake had temporarily suspended ordinary rules of perception. Officials documented the incident with methodical attention, noting every footprint, every ripple, every scrap of evidence. Yet the lake's vastness rendered many questions impossible to answer definitively. Reports included temperature readings, current measurements, and descriptions of the shoreline gradient. Boats scanned shallow waters, divers examined inlets, and foot patrols traced the banks for kilometers in both directions. Despite these efforts, no trace of the missing person emerged. The combination of scale, environmental complexity, and the transient nature of shoreline evidence created a situation in which even meticulous documentation could not resolve the disappearance. Local guides and residents offered historical context, recounting previous disappearances along the lake's edges and the unpredictable hazards created by currents, underwater drop-offs, and seasonal ice, all verified through official records. Lake Baikal's unique geological and hydrological properties make its shoreline deceptively unstable. Areas that appear walkable can conceal deep silt or sudden undercut ledges. Seasonal changes also transform the terrain, with melting snow and ice creating temporary streams and hidden pockets of water. These environmental factors help explain why even a brief excursion along the shore can result in a person vanishing from sight in a matter of minutes. Even after extensive searches, no trace was found, leaving the disappearance unresolved and placing it among the region's most puzzling open cases, where the natural environment itself seems to swallow events whole. Over the following weeks, teams returned intermittently, combing the shoreline with sonar equipment, divers, and trained dogs. But the lake offered no evidence. Reports concluded with only known facts: the last verified location, the environmental conditions, and the scope of the search. Each new effort failed to produce a resolution, reinforcing the sense that whatever occurred at Lake Baikal's edge existed beyond immediate comprehension. As the sun dips low behind the distant ridges, the shoreline returns to silence, every wave and rustle of foliage echoing the absence left behind, a reminder that Lake Baikal preserves its secrets as effortlessly as it holds its waters. Tourists and locals pass the banks unaware of the disappearance, the vast lake reflecting only the sky and distant mountains. Its immense depth and clarity suggest permanence, yet beneath the surface lies an enduring mystery, a moment in time that the shoreline remembers silently, even if humans cannot. The lake stretches onward, vast and indifferent, holding whatever passed along its edge that day where no eye could follow, and no explanation has yet reached the surface. The Jasper National Park Snowfield Case. A bitter wind swept across the high-altitude snowfields of Jasper National Park, carrying flakes that stung exposed skin and muffled every sound in the frozen expanse. The terrain stretched in a jagged mosaic of ice and hardened snow, where ridges alternated with shallow gullies and sudden drop-offs. On one late winter afternoon, a young hiker was making their way along a known backcountry route, a path that locals had traversed for decades without incident. Yet something about the snowfield that day seemed different, ominously so. Within moments, the hiker vanished from sight, leaving companions stunned and the landscape eerily unbroken. A hiker's boots crunched against hardened snow as they navigated a narrow ridge, leaving footprints that seemed to vanish almost immediately beneath drifting powder. Small clouds of snow swirled around their legs, and patches of ice glinted deceptively, reflecting the pale winter sky. The hiker paused frequently, examining ice-crusted rocks and tracing the faint outline of a frozen stream. In those moments, companions reported, the wind picked up suddenly, and when they turned to speak, the figure they had been following had disappeared from view. No calls for help were heard, and the snow remained otherwise undisturbed. The alpine terrain rose and fell abruptly, glaciers and crevasses weaving a labyrinth of ice that could conceal a person in plain sight within moments. Steep slopes gave way to snowfields that appeared deceptively flat, and sudden dips in the landscape created blind spots that could hide even the most obvious movement. Rocks protruded from the surface sporadically, and snow cornices curled over ridges, forming fragile, unstable ledges. Any misstep could send a person sliding into a hidden crevasse, yet no one observed such a fall. The disappearance occurred so swiftly and in such apparent safety that the very nature of the terrain seemed to resist explanation. When the hiker failed to reach a designated waypoint, companions and rangers fanned out across ridges and gullies, moving slowly and deliberately to comb every slope. Teams coordinated in overlapping search lines, shouting across valleys and scanning from exposed high points. Snowshoes crunched rhythmically, while avalanche probes and poles tapped the snow in repeated arcs. Even with a careful strategy, the enormity of the snowfield and the complexity of the terrain made coverage incomplete. Every movement and observation was slowed by icy patches and unstable snow, creating a sense of futility even as rescuers pressed forward with meticulous intent. Snow offered no clues, no displaced rocks, no scattered gear, and no indication whether the missing individual had stepped onto a hidden crevasse or slipped into a snowbank. Footprints that existed moments earlier had been covered by drifting powder, while the frozen surface bore no sign of sliding or struggle. Companions searched with gloved hands and ice axes, brushing away snow from potential depressions and examining every mound and ridge, yet every lead dissolved into nothing. The snowfield appeared untouched, a blank canvas that mocked the urgency of the human effort beneath the open sky. Changing weather compounded the mystery, as clouds swept in from the peaks and wind sculpted the surface, masking footprints and transforming familiar contours into an unfamiliar landscape. Visibility diminished as white sheets of snow swirled across ridges, and the sunlight that filtered through cloud breaks reflected off icy surfaces in ways that disoriented searchers. Even experienced guides reported difficulty gauging distance and slope, and the missing hiker's path became increasingly impossible to trace. What had been a small, well-known route now felt alien, emphasizing the fragility of human perception in high-altitude environments. Teams probed every drift, scanned every ridge, and measured every crevasse with painstaking care, yet the vastness of the snowfield left gaps that no human effort could fully bridge. They employed avalanche dogs, high-vantage observation, and careful mapping of every slope, yet hours of methodical work produced nothing tangible. Helicopters scouted from above, but swirling snow and wind currents concealed even the largest disturbances. As time passed, it became clear that the snowfield's immense scale and shifting surfaces created a landscape capable of swallowing evidence without a trace, turning the disappearance into a riddle that the terrain itself seemed to guard. Guides with decades of alpine experience warned that snowfields conceal more than tracks. Sudden ice shelves, hidden gullies, and expected snow build-up have baffled rescuers in verified past incidents. Jasper National Park's glaciers and high ridges are notorious for producing disappearances, with reports stretching back decades. Park records document hikers found days later in snow pockets far from their last known position, or never recovered at all. This context did little to explain why the current disappearance occurred under clear weather and in a familiar area, yet it provided insight into how quickly snow and ice can erase even the most obvious traces. Days passed with repeated sweeps, from sunrise to fading light, without any indication of movement, reinforcing the unsettling reality that the snowfield had seemingly absorbed the person completely. Searchers reported a growing unease as the terrain returned to its pristine state each morning, footprints and disturbances erased by wind or drifting snow. Despite thorough documentation and careful attention, every attempt to locate the hiker ended in the same frustrating emptiness. The snowfield remained indifferent, a silent observer that revealed nothing, and the disappearance gradually took on the weight of a mystery rooted in both nature's power and human limitation. As dusk settled over the high ridges, the frozen terrain returned to silence, cold and pristine, bearing no trace of the hiker who had vanished into it hours before. Snow cornices reflected the fading light in muted silver, crevasses and gullies stretched unseen beneath untouched powder, and the surrounding peaks cast long, shadowed forms across the expanse. The chill air carried only the faintest whispers of wind, yet every sound seemed amplified against the empty snowfield. Here, the mountain remained absolute, its frozen slopes guarding secrets that no search, no effort, and no human skill could claim. Beneath the snow's immaculate surface, something remains unaccounted for, as if the mountain had quietly claimed it for its own. Koskela National Park and the missing surveyor. The dense canopy of Koskela National Park muffled even the sharpest sounds, while sunlight filtering through the leaves traced shifting patterns on the uneven forest floor, where a surveyor had begun a routine mapping assignment. The terrain was a mosaic of ridges, streams, and pockets of dense undergrowth, familiar to those who worked in the park but capable of confounding anyone moving too quickly or inattentively. With careful steps, the surveyor moved between marked reference points, laying down flags and noting coordinates, confident in both skill and method. Yet in a forest that had been traversed countless times, something was about to disturb that expectation. With a compass in hand and notes carefully aligned in a field notebook, the surveyor marked reference points and measured distances between ridges, trusting the methodical precision that guided years of professional work. Every step was deliberate, every measurement double-checked, as if control could guarantee safety even in the unpredictable wilderness. The instruments, theodolite, tripod, and level, were all arranged with care, their precise alignment reflecting the meticulous nature of surveying work. It was routine, controlled, predictable, but routine, as it would later prove, could not account for the forest's quiet capacity to swallow someone whole. Around the survey site, the forest was alive with subtle motion. A creek whispered over rocks, birds flitted between branches, and a faint wind bent young saplings, all combining into an environment that could disorient even a practiced observer. The surveyor paused periodically to scan distant ridges, noting subtle changes in elevation or foliage patterns. Every sound, every shift in light, was catalogued mentally and recorded in notes. To a casual observer, the area might have seemed calm and ordinary. To those who understood the interplay of forest, slope, and stream, it was a complex space where one misstep or momentary distraction could have unpredictable consequences. When colleagues returned from a short reconnaissance, they found the surveyor's tripod still standing, the transit instrument undisturbed, but the person who had been operating it nowhere in sight. There was no sign of struggle, no disrupted soil, and no trail of footprints leading away from the clearing. It was as if the individual had simply vanished, leaving behind a scene of mechanical precision intact, yet utterly devoid of human presence. Panic rose gradually, tempered by disbelief, as those present attempted to reconcile what they saw with what they knew of the park and the surveyor's careful habits. Rangers and team members immediately organised coordinated search lines, moving deliberately through underbrush, along ridge lines, and across streams, measuring each step with care to avoid missing any subtle clue. Every slope, every fallen log, and every rocky outcropping was checked systematically. Searchers called out names, listened for echoes, and scanned underbrush for movement. Despite a structured approach, the density of the forest and the intricacy of the terrain made it difficult to maintain line of sight or establish a coherent search perimeter. Each minute spent in careful exploration underscored both the determination and the limitations of human effort in such an environment. Despite careful inspection, the forest yielded no evidence. No footprints beyond the clearing, no dropped equipment, and no sign of struggle, leaving only the intact survey station as a silent witness to the disappearance. The notebooks remained on the tripod stand, pencils in place, as though the surveyor might return at any moment to continue the work. Tools were untouched, flags still marking reference points, and the carefully measured lines remained undisturbed. Nothing suggested where the missing individual might have gone, or if they had gone at all. The forest had absorbed the event, leaving only meticulous order in place of human presence. Technical challenges compounded the search. Thick foliage blocked sight lines, uneven terrain slowed movement, and the dense network of waterways made it difficult to establish a clear path of travel or determine where the surveyor might have gone. Creeks and boggy depressions interrupted line of sight and forced searchers to split into smaller groups, each covering discrete zones. The park's ridges cast shadows that concealed subtle depressions, and fallen trees created natural barriers. Even with mapping coordinates, the area offered countless opportunities for a person to disappear from view, and the complexity of the terrain ensured that any reconstruction of movement was fraught with uncertainty. Park records noted that Koskela had a small number of prior disappearances involving hikers or workers, but never a case where a trained professional vanished in a familiar area while conducting routine duties. Some incidents involved temporary disorientation or minor injuries, but none reflected the unsettling combination of predictability and sudden absence that marked this case. The historical context added weight to the mystery. A forest capable of swallowing evidence entirely, where even skilled and experienced individuals could vanish without leaving a trace, suggested patterns the human mind struggled to fully grasp. Investigators reviewed all equipment and measurements, cross-referencing field notes with topographical maps, yet every methodical analysis only confirmed the inexplicable nature of the disappearance and the absence of tangible clues. Survey coordinates were verified, instruments rechecked for misalignment, and every potential human error accounted for, but each step deepened the sense of the impossible. What had seemed like a predictable procedural assignment had transformed into a puzzle-defying logic, a reminder that expertise and preparation can falter against the subtle power of wilderness. As twilight settled over the forest, the clearing where the surveyor had worked seemed ordinary again, shadows stretching across the tripod and notes, while the surrounding trees stood silent, guarding secrets that human skill could not penetrate. Birds fell silent, the creek's whisper softened, and the wind carried only the faint rustle of leaves. The instruments, precise and unmoving, reflected no disturbance. And in that quiet, the forest seemed to assert its own measure of control, indifferent to human effort and entirely capable of concealing the truth behind a disappearance that would remain unresolved. In the stillness of Koskela's forest, it was as if the surveyor had been absorbed into the land itself, leaving behind only questions that no map or instrument could answer. The Tongariro Alpine Crossing Incident. The rugged ridges of the Tongariro Alpine Crossing rose sharply against a sky streaked with cloud, volcanic vents hissing faintly in the distance as a small group of hikers set out along the well-marked trail. The trail, though popular and heavily trafficked during the summer months, slices across a volcanic landscape that shifts unpredictably underfoot. Jagged lava outcrops alternate with patches of scree, and shallow craters filled with turquoise water reflect an otherworldly light. For hikers accustomed to more temperate terrain, the crossing presents both breathtaking views and subtle hazards. Yet even familiarity with maps and guidebooks could not account for what was about to occur along this exposed ridge. Equipped with maps, walking poles, and layered jackets, the hikers moved deliberately, scanning each volcanic ridge and crater lake for reference points, while noting the treacherous scree underfoot. Footing required constant attention. Loose stones skittered under boots, and small ridges appeared deceptively solid until they shifted beneath weight. Guides reminded the group to move in pairs, maintaining line of sight, and to pause frequently for observation and notes. Every measured step was intended to prevent mishap, yet the crossing's combination of popularity and natural hazards created a fragile sense of security, one that would be irrevocably challenged in moments to come. Steam drifted from fumaroles, carrying the faint smell of sulphur, and the wind cut across the exposed ridges in sudden gusts, bending grass and scattering loose stones as if testing the traveller's balance. Clouds sometimes obscured distant peaks, and the uneven terrain forced hikers to adjust their footing continuously. Each element of the environment, the noise of shifting scree, the hiss of steam, the shifting shadows, added a layer of sensory distraction, challenging concentration and awareness. The landscape itself seemed to pulse with quiet activity, simultaneously beautiful and disorienting, reminding those who traversed it that nature rarely conformed to human expectation. It was only after one hiker paused at a particularly jagged lava flow that companions noticed a sudden absence. The person who had been beside them, now missing without a sound or trace. Calls and whistles carried across the ridges, but no answer returned. Initially, the group assumed the individual had paused further along the trail or descended into a minor depression between lava fields. Minutes passed with no response, and unease grew. Something about the disappearance felt immediate and complete, as though the hiker had been swallowed by the landscape in an instant, leaving nothing behind to indicate movement or direction. Park rangers and nearby guides quickly began scanning ridges and crater edges, calling names and shouting across rocky gullies, their voices absorbed by the volcanic terrain and echoing in unexpected directions. Teams split along predetermined lines, checking crater rims, scree slopes, and hidden depressions. Binoculars swept distant lava flows, and every ridge was combed in methodical detail. Despite the popularity of the crossing, the terrain's natural complexity made even organised searches frustratingly slow and uncertain. Volunteers were added as reports of the disappearance spread, yet even with numbers, the environment resisted full control or visibility. Every search revealed the same unsettling pattern. No footprints in the scree, no dropped equipment, and no evidence that the missing hiker had moved from the trail or stumbled into a fissure. The volcanic soil often preserves impressions, yet here, nothing registered beyond the usual markings of hikers who'd passed that morning. Personal items such as jackets, poles, or water bottles remained where they had been last seen with the group. The precision of absence, paired with the natural hazards of the environment, made the situation eerily inexplicable. How could a person disappear entirely while remaining on a well-travelled open trail? Fog rolled down from higher slopes, and shifting scree along the crater's edge concealed depressions, while sudden steam vents and uneven lava flows made even careful navigation unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Rangers and guides had to adjust strategies constantly, avoiding unstable ground while keeping sightlines for search coordination. Even minor vents released bursts of steam that obscured vision temporarily, and clouds forming suddenly at ridge level could mask larger depressions or gullies. Each natural feature, though ordinary in isolation, contributed to an environment that could obscure movement entirely, even for someone visible moments before. Historical records noted accidents on the crossing, mostly involving slips, falls, or temporary disorientation, yet the complete absence of a person under such circumstances remained exceptionally rare and troubling to authorities. Seasonal reports included hikers stranded by fog or minor injuries from loose scree, but few events involved anyone vanishing without a trace. Park guides recalled minor incidents from decades prior, none of which had remained unresolved in the same manner. The unusual nature of the disappearance quickly drew attention from regional authorities and media, though details were carefully limited to protect privacy and avoid sensationalism. Investigators later examined trail logs, weather reports, and witness statements, but each methodical check reinforced the same unresolved truth. No trace of the missing hiker could be found along the heavily travelled path. Notes on trail conditions, GPS coordinates, and sighting timelines were compared with photographs and guide observations. The analysis confirmed the environment was consistent with normal seasonal conditions. Nothing suggested a sudden volcanic event, storm, or geological collapse. Yet the hiker remained absent, unaccounted for by every logical scenario, leaving investigators with an event that defied routine explanation. As the sun sank behind volcanic ridges, the crossing's craters and lava fields returned to quiet, the wind whispering over jagged rock and steaming vents, leaving the trail seemingly ordinary, yet charged with the tension of unexplained absence. Visitors continued to traverse sections of the route in the following days, unaware of what had occurred along the exposed ridge. The landscape appeared stable, inviting, and well-marked, yet within its beauty lay an invisible void, a space where human presence could vanish entirely. Even experienced guides admitted that the environment, capable of hiding a person in plain sight, was more mysterious than any prior incident they had witnessed. Somewhere amid the volcanic ridges and steaming craters, the hiker vanished, swallowed by a landscape that offers both guidance and concealment in equal measure. The Bavarian forest ranger who never returned. The dense stands of spruce and fir in Bavaria's protected forest loomed overhead, their trunks rising in rigid lines as a lone ranger moved along a trail rarely disturbed by casual visitors. Narrow paths wound between old-growth trees, their bark rough and mottled, and the forest floor was littered with the detritus of decades, fallen branches, pine needles, and scattered cones that crackled underfoot. While the trail itself was well maintained, the surrounding vegetation created a natural maze, bending sightlines and obscuring the landscape beyond a few meters. For the ranger, whose duties included monitoring wildlife populations, checking remote boundaries and inspecting park infrastructure, this particular route was familiar, traversed hundreds of times with confidence and care. Yet familiarity offers no guarantees, and the forest often retains secrets that evade even the most practiced eye. Each step was deliberate, boots crunching on layers of old needles and twigs, while the ranger paused at markers and inspection points, recording observations in a leather-bound notebook with practiced precision. A keen sense of orientation guided the patrol. Each junction, fallen tree, and small ravine had been catalogued mentally over months of work. Notes on animal tracks and water flow were updated with meticulous accuracy, allowing the ranger to anticipate movement patterns of wildlife and forest conditions with near certainty. Even routine checks could take hours, as the complex terrain required constant vigilance. The forest demanded attention not just for safety, but to maintain the integrity of the park and its ecosystems. Underbrush curled around fallen logs, and streams hidden beneath leafy overhangs whispered, hinting at movement just beyond human perception, where the forest seemed alive with unseen activity. Squirrels, deer, and occasional foxes left traces in subtle patterns, while birds communicated in sharp calls that echoed between tree trunks. The ranger moved deliberately, attuned to these cues, pausing to document unusual signs or interruptions in tracks. Even the smallest detail, a displaced stone or a subtle shift in leaf litter, could indicate environmental changes or animal activity. The forest's richness was both fascinating and demanding, requiring a heightened awareness that could never eliminate uncertainty. Attention to routine turned to alarm when colleagues reviewing radio check-ins realized the ranger had vanished, leaving no sign of passage through the intricate tangle of roots and narrow clearings. Scheduled communications went unanswered, and the last confirmed location placed the ranger near a remote segment of trail bordered by thick undergrowth. Park headquarters quickly organized a response, notifying search teams and local authorities. As personnel arrived, the realization grew that this disappearance was not the result of minor disorientation or delay. Something had occurred that neither natural obstacles nor personal oversight could explain. Teams immediately combed the area, navigating steep hollows, clusters of brambles, and uneven forest floor, calling the ranger's name with voices that carried unevenly through the dense vegetation. Searchers split into coordinated groups covering overlapping sectors, while some ascended nearby ridges to gain vantage points. Even experienced personnel noted the unusual difficulty of maintaining orientation, as familiar features appeared distorted by dense growth and subtle elevation changes. Every known path, trail junction, and water crossing was examined, yet the forest seemed to resist discovery, concealing rather than revealing any hint of the missing individual. Each inspected section yielded nothing. No torn clothing, no discarded tools, no footprints leading to watercourses or ravines, as though the person had been removed entirely from the forest's fabric. Rangers were trained to anticipate human error, accidental injury, or minor falls, yet the absence of any material trace defied all standard explanations. Personal effects were accounted for at the beginning of the patrol, and no deviations from routine were noted in prior reports. The methodical nature of the Rangers' work contrasted sharply with the sudden and total disappearance, amplifying the mystery and raising difficult questions about what could have caused such an event in a controlled environment. The terrain offered subtle hazards, uneven ground, concealed depressions, and sudden inclines that could mislead even an experienced ranger, transforming familiar routes into disorienting passages. Steep hollows were obscured by thick bracken, fallen trees formed natural barriers, and the dense canopy created alternating patterns of light and dark that could distort perception. Even minimal noise echoed in unexpected ways, making it difficult to locate colleagues or track movement. The forest's natural complexity, usually accounted for by rangers, now worked against those attempting to resolve the disappearance, turning every logical step into a potential dead end. Historical accounts of the Bavarian forest note missing hikers and lost campers, but the disappearance of a professional ranger on duty remained unprecedented, amplifying concern among those who searched. Prior cases had involved straying, inclement weather, or navigational errors, but this instance did not match any prior pattern. Local authorities, accustomed to occasional incidents, recognized the unusual implications. A person trained in both the terrain and search protocols had simply ceased to exist in an area they knew intimately. The absence challenged assumptions about human control and familiarity, demonstrating that expertise could not always overcome the forest's vast complexity. Investigation of ranger logs, trail maps, and equipment inventories provided no clues. The meticulous records only confirmed that the disappearance could not be explained by ordinary accidents or human error. Review of GPS data, inspection of boundary markers, and interviews with nearby staff produced no new leads. The pattern of disappearance suggested a sudden event, yet no environmental factor, wildlife interaction, or logistical mishap could account for the vanishing. Each hypothesis collapsed under the weight of empirical observation, leaving authorities and researchers with an unresolved mystery that resisted closure. By nightfall, the forest settled into its usual rhythms of distant animal calls and the occasional rustle of fallen branches, yet the absence of one guardian left a tension woven through the landscape. The forest itself seemed unchanged, as if indifferent to human presence or absence. Trails remained open, markers stood upright, and undergrowth persisted in quiet continuity. Yet the absence lingered, tangible in the collective unease of those who had known the ranger and walked these paths in search of an answer. Every familiar feature of the forest now carried the weight of uncertainty, a reminder that even disciplined vigilance cannot guarantee safety in an environment this old and intricate. In the labyrinth of trunks, gullies, and tangled roots, the ranger disappeared, leaving the forest's silence to guard a secret that no search could penetrate. Aconcagua Provincial Park's abandoned camp. Tents clustered on a narrow plateau beneath the looming face of Aconcagua, the high Andes stretching into jagged ridges that pierced thin, cold air. The base camp had been established with precision, tarps tightly secured, gear arranged for efficiency, and climbing tools neatly organized. Despite the mountain's reputation for harsh weather and sudden shifts, the team had carefully assessed conditions before settling, confident in their preparation. Yet, by the next morning, one climber had vanished, leaving a camp that appeared entirely intact, as if nothing had occurred except for the inexplicable absence of a human presence amid extreme altitude and silence. Gear was meticulously arranged, sleeping bags rolled, stoves and fuel canisters stacked neatly, and backpacks left open for the coming day's ascent. The climber had followed every precaution, and every piece of equipment was accounted for. Food supplies, ropes, and oxygen cylinders lay undisturbed, each item exactly where it should have been. Observers later noted the contrast between the thoroughness of the camp and the sudden void left by the missing individual, creating a tension that seemed to echo through the surrounding peaks. It was a disappearance that violated the normal expectations of even high-altitude expeditions. Glacial moraines carved the landscape into abrupt ridges and hidden depressions, while scree fields shifted subtly with each step, offering both pathways and hidden hazards. The nearby glacier shimmered under the clear morning sky, and fissures ran like jagged scars along its frozen surface. Even the most experienced climbers recognized that the terrain could transform with the slightest misstep, but in this case, there were no footprints, no disturbed snow, no traces of the climber beyond the carefully maintained camp. The mountain's scale emphasized the vulnerability of any individual who might stray even briefly from a safe zone. Alarm was first raised when companions returned from a short reconnaissance walk along a nearby ridge, expecting only a few minutes' separation. The missing climber's tent was untouched, gear neatly positioned as if the person had never left. Calls were made, signals attempted, and a brief search of the immediate surroundings revealed nothing unusual. The absence quickly transformed from an oversight to a serious concern, and expedition leaders recognized that they faced a disappearance that could not be explained by a simple delay or momentary disorientation. Investigators began systematically checking tents, supplies, and the surrounding snow patches, noting the meticulous order of every item. Cooking equipment, water containers, and personal items remained exactly as they had been the night before. No footprints were extending from the camp to the slopes above or the rocky outcrops below. Even small items that might have been carried inadvertently were in place. It was as if the individual had simply ceased to exist in the exact location they had last been observed, a phenomenon that confounded rescuers accustomed to predicting human movement in such conditions. Search teams extended their efforts outward, ascending steep ridges, probing crevasses, and tracing the edges of the glacier, yet the high-altitude terrain offered no clue. Ropes were anchored for safety, teams moved in coordinated sweeps, and experienced guides scrutinized the most likely escape routes. Still, there was no trace, no discarded equipment, no signs of struggle, no hint of passage. The methodical approach of professionals collided with an unyielding absence, deepening the sense that the disappearance had occurred beyond the reach of normal understanding or natural hazard. Altitude compounded the difficulties. Thin air left rescuers winded after only short efforts, and sudden temperature drops forced frequent pauses. The terrain's steep slopes, hidden crevices, and shifting scree required careful movement, and daylight hours were short. Even for seasoned climbers, the environment imposed a strict set of limitations, slowing the search and adding a layer of peril. Yet, at every turn the mountain yielded nothing. Each careful observation, each measured step, returned only emptiness where human presence had once existed. Although Aconcagua is known for climbers confronting frost, altitude sickness, and unpredictable weather, this disappearance was anomalous. Historical records in the park indicated accidents and delayed descents, but rarely had someone vanished from a well-established camp under clear weather without evidence of misstep or exposure. The climber had followed standard safety protocols, and nothing in the immediate environment suggested a sudden threat. The precision of preparation made the outcome all the more perplexing, illustrating how even the most controlled high-altitude scenario can harbour profound uncertainty. Examination of expedition logs, permits, and gear inventories provided no insights. Written records confirmed that all equipment had been accounted for, and no deviations from routine occurred. Witnesses reported no unusual sounds, signals, or disturbances overnight. Climbers trained to anticipate hazards and monitor each other for signs of fatigue or disorientation could find no explanation for the event. The disappearance remained isolated, sudden, and inexplicable, a case in which every precaution had been observed and yet had offered no protection from the unknown. By late afternoon, the camp appeared as it had the previous evening, tents pitched in orderly rows, supplies arranged neatly, and climbing tools ready for the next leg of ascent. Snow shimmered across the plateau, reflecting the peaks around it with harsh clarity. The absence of one climber, however, transformed this scene from a routine base camp into a haunting tableau, an unspoken reminder that mountains of such scale hold power over human plains. Observers could only stand and survey the site, aware that this disappearance defied both expectation and explanation, leaving a profound sense of unease among those present. The climber was gone, and the empty camp, frost-lined gear, and immense peaks around it offered no answer for a disappearance that seemed to defy every measure of human caution. The Table Mountain Disappearance Files. The flat-topped expanse of Table Mountain rises above Cape Town, drawing hikers, climbers and tourists with its panoramic views, yet beneath the familiar vistas lie disappearances that continue to perplex authorities. Visitors traverse trails that are well mapped and heavily trafficked, yet there are recorded cases in which individuals vanish suddenly, leaving belongings behind and defying explanation. The park's accessibility seems to contradict the gravity of these events, creating a tension between the known and the unknowable. Even seasoned guides who have worked the mountain for decades acknowledge that certain vanishings remain inexplicable, defying logic despite the terrain's familiarity. One hiker, last seen near the Skeleton Gorge trailhead, disappeared without a trace, leaving a fully packed backpack and water bottles behind. Witnesses reported that the person had paused to rest, clearly visible from the trail, and then simply vanished. Search efforts immediately followed, yet no footprints, sliding marks, or signs of movement could be found in any direction. The suddenness and proximity to other hikers made the case particularly confounding, illustrating how a disappearance can occur even under careful observation. Authorities noted that this incident would become one of several that collectively formed the so-called Table Mountain disappearance files. The mountain itself presents a series of challenges. Cliff edges drop sharply into deep gullies, often hidden from the view of passing hikers. Dense patches of fynbos, the region's endemic shrubbery, grow in tight pockets along ledges and slopes, creating natural blind spots that conceal movement. Even from a short distance, uneven rock formations can obscure small shifts in terrain, making it difficult for rescuers or bystanders to detect anything amiss. In several cases, the missing were last seen near these areas, heightening speculation about the role of the environment without providing concrete answers. The sun casts long shadows over the ridges, and while these shadows are familiar to locals, they can create illusions of continuity along precarious cliff faces. Another disappearance occurred along the Platte Clip Gorge, one of the park's most frequently travelled paths. A day visitor was reported missing after leaving personal items, including sunglasses and a jacket, on a rock ledge. Rangers later described the scene as curiously preserved, noting that the placement of the belongings suggested a pause rather than a fall or struggle. Volunteers who assisted in the search remarked on the way the rocks appeared undisturbed despite the sudden absence. Even experienced climbers familiar with the trail could not account for the sudden void, a detail that has perplexed investigators and reinforced the sense of a phenomenon beyond ordinary explanation. Patterns became evident as investigators reviewed previous cases. Many occurred in broad daylight, often with dozens of other hikers nearby. Personal effects remained undisturbed. Trails showed no unusual markings, and no sound or movement was reported at the moment of disappearance. Experts noted that the mountain's physical features could conceal a person momentarily, yet these vanishings were too prolonged and complete to be explained by simple misperception. Some cases involved hikers ascending or descending known routes, while others were last seen near viewpoints where dozens of visitors had recently passed, suggesting a disappearance that occurs in spite of both attention and oversight. Search and rescue efforts followed rigorous protocols. Teams combed cliff edges, gullies and fynbos-covered slopes, deploying search dogs, drones and aerial surveys. Helicopters scanned inaccessible ridges, and volunteers assisted in methodical sweeps along established trails. Maps and GPS tracking were cross-referenced with prior searches to identify overlooked areas, yet nothing substantial was recovered beyond personal items or minor environmental traces. The thoroughness of the operations, coupled with the mountain's accessibility, amplified the mystery, demonstrating how disappearances could occur in spaces that were heavily monitored and ostensibly safe, defying expectations for such a public and well-documented environment. Visitors often describe the sounds of the mountain: birds calling across ridges, distant waterfalls echoing in valleys, and the whisper of wind through shrubs. These natural echoes can distort perception, and some witnesses report hearing indistinct noises or catching glimpses of movement at the edge of their vision. While these accounts remain anecdotal, they contribute to the mountain's enigmatic reputation, suggesting that human observation, no matter how attentive, may be insufficient to fully apprehend the environment's complexities. Rangers have noted that certain gullies seem to absorb sound, creating an almost unnatural silence where movement could go unnoticed. Archival records compiled over decades reveal a pattern of infrequent yet perplexing disappearances. Most individuals had been experienced hikers or climbers, familiar with basic safety measures and aware of the mountain's potential hazards. Despite this, they vanished in conditions that appeared safe, leaving authorities and family members grappling with the absence of plausible explanations. The rarity of such events makes them all the more unsettling as the mountain continues to host countless visitors without incident, or while a few are claimed by circumstances that remain opaque. Historical records, ranging from early 20th century logs to contemporary reports, show that disappearances often cluster around the same trails and viewpoints, though no single factor has been identified. Experts have proposed numerous theories: accidental falls into hidden gullies, sudden medical emergencies, disorientation, or even encounters with wildlife. None of these, however, satisfactorily accounts for the repeated pattern in which belongings are left undisturbed, trails remain unmarked, and the individuals vanish completely. Investigators note that while steep drops and hidden crevices are obvious hazards, in several cases individuals were last seen on flat exposed sections of trail with no immediate danger. The combination of human precision, environmental challenges, and sudden disappearance resists conventional logic, leaving each case unresolved and forming a body of mysteries unique to Table Mountain National Park. By the end of each day, trails are cleared of hikers, the sun retreats behind distant peaks, and the park returns to its usual rhythm. Yet the disappearance files linger, each incident a reminder that the mountain can conceal more than its vistas suggest. Rangers continue to monitor known risk areas, hikers remain vigilant, and the files themselves grow slowly, a quiet accumulation of unexplained vanishings. The ordinary appearance of the paths belies the extraordinary events recorded in official logs, and for those who study the cases, the contrast between familiarity and anomaly is inescapable, leaving an uneasy awareness that the mountain holds secrets beyond human comprehension. Even on a sunlit trail filled with visitors, someone can disappear into Table Mountain's folds and never be seen again. Olympic National Park's Elwha Valley case. The Elwha Valley, carved by the winding river that bears its name, is deceptively accessible, with established trails and logging roads threading through dense stands of old-growth forest. Yet, it has harboured disappearances that defy explanation. Hikers and nature enthusiasts traverse these paths regularly, expecting the safety of clearly marked routes and frequent ranger patrols. Still, the valley has claimed those who seem to move confidently through its shadows, leaving behind only unanswered questions. The combination of visibility, human activity, and sudden absence creates a tension that has drawn investigators for decades, a reminder that even familiar terrain can conceal the inexplicable. One visitor, last seen pausing near the riverbank to adjust gear, simply vanished while in view of other hikers, leaving personal belongings untouched on a moss-covered log. Witnesses reported the person speaking briefly with companions, then turning toward a small side trail that led to a thicket of ferns and fallen logs. Moments later, the individual was gone. Park rangers arrived quickly, and a search began, yet nothing was found. No footprints, no clothing, and no sign of distress. The abruptness of the disappearance challenged all conventional assumptions about wilderness safety and human error. Towering firs and hemlocks surround the valley, their branches forming a dense canopy that diffuses sunlight and distorts depth perception, making even familiar terrain treacherous and disorienting. Moss-covered rocks and fallen branches create a labyrinth of visual obstacles, while the constant movement of leaves in the wind can camouflage small figures. The interplay of light and shadow shifts continuously throughout the day, subtly altering one's perception of distance and position. Even experienced hikers have noted moments when the forest seems to play tricks on the eyes, yet the sudden disappearances in Elwha Valley transcend mere optical illusions. Rangers arrived within hours, conducting methodical searches along river trails, tributary inlets, and moss-covered rock outcrops, yet found no trace of the missing individual, leaving only disturbed vegetation and the echoes of human voices. Teams split into coordinated units, checking every possible hiding spot, examining every rocky crevice and fallen log. They called out repeatedly, listening for responses that never came. Volunteers followed behind, combing trails with flashlights and radios, but even the most thorough sweeps produced only the quiet persistence of the river and the soft hum of the forest. Other hikers recalled hearing sudden splashes or glimpsing fleeting movement among the undergrowth, Yet when they investigated, no one was there, a contradiction that deepened the mystery. Small disturbances in the leaf litter suggested recent passage, but the tracks led nowhere, vanishing as abruptly as the person they had accompanied. Some reported hearing muted voices or faint rustling of branches, yet the source was never found. These accounts, though anecdotal, contributed to the valley's growing reputation as a place where ordinary perception could fail and where human presence seemed to disappear without a trace. As the search expanded, teams combed tributaries, riverbanks, and steep forested slopes, deploying tracking dogs and coordinating aerial reconnaissance, but the terrain swallowed every lead and scent trails proved inconclusive. Helicopters hovered over the winding river, scanning with infrared cameras, yet the dense canopy obscured ground-level details. Boats navigated the slower stretches of the Elfar, but even in clearings along the water's edge, nothing was found. The combination of dense forest, hidden channels, and the river's constant movement created conditions in which traditional search methods were surprisingly ineffective, leaving investigators frustrated and puzzled. Investigators noted patterns common to valley disappearances, belongings left behind, no visible signs of struggle, and vanishings occurring within clear sight lines, yet leaving no trace, suggesting phenomena the environment itself could obscure. In some cases, backpacks or jackets remained perfectly arranged, as if the person had intended to return within moments. In others, water bottles or cameras sat on rocks, untouched. The consistent lack of physical evidence suggested that whatever had occurred did not involve panic or struggle, intensifying speculation among search personnel and investigators alike about forces beyond ordinary explanation. Experts debated potential explanations, from sudden falls into concealed river holes, rapid flooding, or disorientation in the rainforest undergrowth, yet none satisfactorily accounted for the consistency of these complete disappearances. Wildlife encounters were considered, including the presence of black bears, cougars, and large river fish, but none could plausibly account for the abruptness, the lack of traces, or the locations where individuals had last been seen. Some posited that microclimates, hidden ravines, or even unusual acoustic phenomena could interfere with perception, yet these remained theoretical, unable to resolve the central question: how could someone vanish entirely in daylight and near other people? Historical records show that the Elfar Valley has long been a site of human activity, from logging and dam construction to restoration projects, yet these activities have not diminished the uncanny frequency of unexplained vanishings in the same stretches of river and forest. Park historians note that even before modern trail networks, travellers and workers reported people going missing for days at a time, sometimes emerging unexpectedly, and sometimes never at all. Maps drawn for logging and scientific surveys, though accurate, do not reveal why the valley has such a consistent pattern of disappearances, leaving researchers to confront both human and natural histories without clear resolution. By evening, the river continues its course, leaves drift downstream, and the valley seems unchanged. Yet the files of missing persons quietly remind all who study them that certain places remain capable of concealing the inexplicable. Visitors leave the trails for cabins and campsites, assuming safety in routine and oversight, while the undergrowth, fallen logs, and twisting tributaries keep secrets. Every sound, cracking branch, moving water, or distant call of a bird carries the tension of what might be hidden just beyond perception. Even as sunlight fades, the valley maintains its ordinary appearance, yet the shadows of uncertainty linger, untouched by explanation. The Elba River moves relentlessly forward, but those who vanished within its valley have left behind only questions that the forest refuses to answer. The Great Basin National Park tracker loss. The ridges of Great Basin National Park stretched vast and quiet, a desert expanse where even movement seemed swallowed before it could be fully seen. Sunlight reflected off pale limestone cliffs, catching the contours of the landscape in stark relief, and yet there was an almost imperceptible tension in the air, a sense that something unusual had already occurred. The day had begun like any other survey excursion, with companions following plotted paths and taking measurements, but by mid-morning a disquiet settled over the open terrain, subtle yet insistent, the kind that seasoned observers know to trust. Companions on the survey noted a sudden, unsettling pause in the day's rhythm, as if the landscape itself had pressed a hand over sound and motion. Conversations faltered, footsteps slowed, and a glance toward a narrow wash revealed an absence that should have been impossible in so exposed a setting. Those present remembered the ordinary noises of the desert, the brush rubbing against boots, the occasional bird call, but suddenly a void replaced them. That emptiness carried its own weight, a silence that seemed deliberate rather than natural, stretching outward across ridges and plateaus as though the desert had shifted without explanation. Jagged limestone outcrops and rolling sagebrush formed deceptive patterns, shadows folding into hollows that confounded perception and made every path uncertain. The desert is notoriously capricious in appearance, where small depressions can seem like canyons and distant ridges appear to shift with perspective. But here, the ordinary tricks of terrain could not account for the complete disappearance of a person who had been moving moments before. Eyes darted to every angle of the surrounding plateaus, attempting to reconcile the solidity of the land with the impossibility of what had occurred. Each glance seemed to reveal a subtle deception, a folding of the landscape that refused explanation. A faint echo bounced across a distant canyon, drawing attention yet yielding nothing tangible, leaving only the sensation of absence in its wake. The sound, like a shifting rock or a distant whistle, was brief and indecipherable, but it unsettled the survey team. When approached, the spot produced nothing more than flat stone and desert debris, untouched and undisturbed. The echo itself seemed to linger, a reminder that the senses can be both reliable and treacherous in open terrain, and that the human eye is ill-equipped to track what the land can conceal. The sun shifted abruptly behind a plateau, casting unexpected dark patches where subtle depressions and rocks seemed to appear and vanish in the eye. This interplay of light and shadow disoriented even the most experienced observers, creating the impression of movement or disturbance where none existed. Companions realized that the terrain itself seemed to distort presence and distance, amplifying the impossibility of locating someone who had vanished in broad daylight on open ground. The ridges and washes, though familiar to seasoned surveyors, now took on a new, unsettling quality, an unpredictable labyrinth of perception and light. Personal items and tools lay untouched, orderly on the ground, betraying no struggle yet hinting at a sudden and inexplicable interruption of ordinary routine. A notebook rested open, a set of surveying markers still in neat order, and a pack remained upright, its contents intact. The scene was ordinary in every respect, yet extraordinary in what it signified, the abrupt disappearance of someone trained to navigate this exact environment. Investigators later noted the dissonance between the organized personal effects and the total absence of the individual, an inconsistency that intensified the mysterious character of the case. Each step taken by those searching seemed to leave no mark. The sand and stone swallowed impressions faster than could be noted, adding to the growing tension. Companions and subsequent searchers moved systematically, attempting to trace paths, yet every line of approach yielded nothing. Even the faintest tracks were obliterated by shifting sand, tiny rock slides, or subtle depressions in the plateau, leaving only the impression that the terrain itself had erased history. This unnerving quality of the land suggested that disappearance here was less about distance or concealment than about the desert's capacity to resist human observation entirely. The surrounding silence carried a weight that felt unnatural, pressing on companions' senses as if the desert itself were aware of something missing. Hours passed in methodical movement across ridges and washes, yet no trace emerged, and the relentless quiet reinforced a growing unease. It was a silence that seemed to demand acknowledgement, a void not just of sound but of expectation, where the desert refused to confirm any normal rhythm of life. For those present, the desert became both a physical and psychological maze, capable of swallowing a human presence without a trace or warning. Attempts to retrace routes led only through plateaus and washes that appeared promising but revealed no clues, amplifying frustration and uncertainty. Observers documented every depression, every potential shadow, yet the open terrain provided no hints. Even known landmarks and surveying markers offered no sense of connection to the vanished figure. The desert's uniformity eroded orientation, and every familiar feature seemed to fold in on itself. By evening, the sense of impossibility was complete. A professional tracker, skilled in reading land and signs, had disappeared into terrain that should have been entirely observable. As twilight deepened over the ridges, shadows lengthened and folded, revealing the emptiness of the terrain while leaving the earlier disappearance unaccounted for. The fading light created contrasts that exaggerated the ridges, turning shallow depressions into apparent chasms, yet nothing explained the absence. The team left the high plateaus reluctantly, carrying the unshakable awareness that some events leave no evidence, and that certain landscapes guard their secrets with an eerie precision. Across the vast, unbroken ridges of the desert, the missing presence remained undetectable, as if the land had claimed it entirely. The Pyrenees National Park radio silence. An abrupt absence of signal shattered the rhythm of the morning, the expected radio check never arriving and leaving colleagues in an unsteady, tense silence. Teams monitoring the alpine routes had grown accustomed to a steady cadence of reports, updates, and casual remarks. Yet, when the silence stretched past its usual window, unease crept in. In an environment defined by vigilance and communication, a missed transmission was not merely inconvenient, it was an alarm. Those responsible for coordination quickly realized that the disappearance of a voice over the airwaves could indicate an event that was sudden, perplexing, and entirely out of the ordinary, even for the notoriously unpredictable Pyrenees. The researchers' planned circuit through the Pyrenees had been meticulous, mapped across ridges and alpine passes known for their challenging terrain and abrupt weather shifts. Experienced in the park's topography, the individual had followed routes regularly used by surveyors, scientists, and mountaineers, with a clear understanding of the perils inherent in each valley, ridge, and gully. Safety protocols were followed precisely, including scheduled check-ins via radio, making the sudden lack of contact not just unusual, but alarming to colleagues who trusted in the reliability of both procedure and participant. Every detail of the route was accounted for, yet the outcome defied expectation. Towering cliffs and narrow gullies funneled wind and sound in unexpected ways, creating an environment where perception itself could be unreliable. From certain angles, shadows distorted distances, and echoes played tricks on the ear, making it difficult to discern movement or orientation. Even the most experienced observers found themselves second-guessing the simplest cues: the snap of a twig, a distant call, or the flutter of a bird taking flight. The topography, while well documented, became a living puzzle in which each ridge could conceal as easily as it revealed, intensifying the sense of disorientation that accompanied the sudden radio silence. Park staff mobilized quickly, initiating standard search protocols and attempting to triangulate the missing signal, yet every effort revealed only gaps and interference. Alpine patrols deployed along known routes, monitoring ridges, gullies, and plateaus, while others attempted to establish whether technical malfunctions could explain the lapse. Helicopters and drones surveyed accessible areas, while base stations reviewed logs and transmissions, searching for a clue in the noise. Despite their expertise and thorough preparation, teams encountered a frustrating consistency. The signal had vanished entirely, leaving no discernible trail, as if erased by an unseen hand in the mountains themselves. Unexpected fog pockets and sudden gusts disrupted both sightlines and radio reception, frustrating search teams accustomed to the area's routine patterns. Visibility shifted rapidly along ridges, and narrow passes trapped sound in ways that created phantom noises or masked genuine calls. Even established markers and cairns offered only partial guidance, and the combination of weather and terrain hindered efforts to systematically cover the area. While conditions were not extreme for the season, their unpredictability compounded the mystery, allowing a disappearance to occur in plain view of a familiar and heavily monitored environment. A hiker descending a nearby trail later reported a fleeting glimpse of a figure moving against the rock, though the fleeting observation added mystery rather than clarity. The report was specific in noting a sudden shadowed form appearing near a scree slope, yet the witness could not identify direction, duration, or any distinguishing features. While it suggested that the missing individual had been present within the landscape, the fleeting nature of the sighting left investigators with more questions than answers. Every team member understood the frustration of a clue that illuminated nothing and seemed to mock the painstaking work of careful observation. Detailed examination of radio logs revealed sporadic transmissions, brief bursts of static, and odd interruptions that provided no clear trail or explanation. Signals appeared fragmented, sometimes overlapping or fading entirely, creating patterns that confounded interpretation. Technicians attempted to map these interruptions against topographic charts, hypothesizing about interference caused by valleys, cliffs, or unusual atmospheric conditions. Each scenario was plausible, yet none accounted fully for the sudden cessation, leaving an unresolved tension between what could be rationalized and what defied explanation in a monitored, controlled environment. Hours stretched into a day without response, the mountain's vastness amplifying both anxiety and disbelief as time deepened the uncertainty. As light shifted across peaks and valleys, search teams expanded their radius, scanning gullies and cliff bases that might conceal even a momentarily hidden figure. The absence of footprints, tracks, or other physical evidence suggested that the individual had moved, or had been moved, without leaving conventional traces, creating a puzzle that drew attention from local authorities and alpine experts alike. By dusk, the scale of the unknown had expanded to occupy every ridge and shadow. After extensive coordination between alpine patrols and local authorities, no trace of the missing individual emerged, leaving every assumption open to doubt. The expected continuity of radio checks, mapped routes, and visual confirmation had been completely disrupted. Teams reviewed every recorded transmission, every search pattern, and every possible angle of approach, yet all inquiries led only to emptiness. The meticulous systems designed to prevent precisely this kind of uncertainty had failed, and the disappearance became a study in how even well-monitored, well-understood environments could harbour events that defied explanation. The incident lingered in memory, a reminder that even carefully monitored environments can conceal a presence entirely and inexplicably. Subsequent attempts to locate or contact the individual met with frustration, not for lack of effort, but for lack of any detectable phenomenon to track. Every procedure executed, every terrain feature surveyed, reinforced the sense of a disappearance that was total, leaving the mountains themselves as silent witnesses to an event with no resolution, no evidence, and no explanation. The airwaves remained empty, carrying only the echo of what had vanished, leaving the Pyrenees to guard their secret in silence. Banff's Moraine Lake Anomaly. A sudden ripple along the far shore drew the attention of early hikers, though no wind or boat could account for the disturbance, hinting at something amiss in the usually tranquil waters of Moraine Lake. The lake, nestled within Banff National Park and framed by the jagged 10 Peaks, is famed for its vibrant turquoise hue, caused by finely ground glacial silt suspended in the water. Yet on the morning in question, something seemed subtly different. Observers described the surface as shivering in a pattern that was not dictated by the breeze, a movement that appeared too precise, too deliberate to be merely natural. While glacial lakes often exhibit strange optical phenomena, this ripple coincided with the last moments the missing hiker would be seen. The missing individual, an experienced backpacker familiar with Banff's trails, had paused near the lake's edge to photograph the 10 Peaks, unaware that the moment would become the start of an enduring mystery. Friends later reported that the hiker was confident in the route, well-equipped, and accustomed to navigating the rugged terrain surrounding Moraine Lake. The path leading to the area is frequented by hikers, yet it also contains hidden ledges, subtle slopes, and sudden drop-offs where someone could become separated from view in an instant. That familiarity, paradoxically, seemed to make the disappearance all the more confounding. There were no navigational errors, no inexperienced missteps to explain it. Several witnesses later described noticing subtle shifts in the lake's colour and texture, changes so slight they were nearly imperceptible, yet collectively pointed to something that defied ordinary explanation. One visitor remembered the water as appearing denser, almost reflective in a way that distorted shadows along the shoreline. Another recalled hearing faint rhythmic splashes, inconsistent with the known habits of wildlife in the area. Though each account alone could be dismissed, the accumulation of these observations created a tension. The landscape was behaving as if it were alive, yet in ways not consistent with known natural phenomena. Park staff responding to the initial report quickly combed the nearby shoreline, noting that the terrain, while well-trodden, offered nooks and ledges where someone could vanish from view almost instantly. Teams of rangers moved along the narrow paths, scanning rocky alcoves and the bases of outcrops, yet found no evidence of a struggle, no dropped items, and no footprints leading into the surrounding forest. The usual markers left behind by hikers, boot prints, disturbed soil, scuffed moss, were absent. For those familiar with Moraine Lake, a location well documented and monitored, this sudden lack of physical traces was disquieting. Strange formations along the water's surface, ice patterns that seemed to appear without explanation, and currents that moved counter to the wind added layers of uncertainty to the search. Even during the summer months, pockets of ice can remain along Moraine Lake's shaded sections, but the patterns observed were unusual for the season, forming arcs and eddies inconsistent with prevailing currents. Hydrologists later confirmed that such formations were unlikely to have emerged spontaneously under existing weather conditions. These anomalies, paired with the disappearance, created a scenario that many searchers described as unnatural but undeniable. As formal search efforts expanded, volunteers and rangers explored adjacent ridges and forested slopes, yet every footpath and clearing yielded only absence, deepening the sense that Moraine Lake itself had absorbed the missing person. The search incorporated grid patterns, rope teams on ledges, and low-altitude aerial reconnaissance, all standard procedures for wilderness recovery in Banff. Dogs were deployed to track scent, but they quickly lost interest once off the immediate shoreline. Each day the search continued without a lead. The lake seemed to mock the effort, presenting a pristine and unchanged landscape, betraying nothing of the event that had just transpired. Technological attempts to track the individual, including cameras and tracking dogs, produced puzzling results, faint footprints leading nowhere, and signals that fluctuated without a discernible source. Infrared cameras positioned along paths captured fleeting heat signatures, but none could be verified as human or tied to the timeline of the disappearance. Park logs show that radio signals from nearby staff occasionally produced static or brief interference, though investigations found no technical cause. The technological anomalies, while subtle, compounded the sense of incompleteness and left even seasoned searchers unsettled. Reports from other hikers included fleeting impressions of movement along the shoreline or distant sounds that could not be corroborated, creating a mosaic of clues that resolved into no coherent pattern. Some described seeing a figure disappear behind a rock formation in moments, yet when approached the area was empty. Others recalled hearing faint voices or splashes but found no physical traces. These accounts, while anecdotal, were documented in official park files, contributing to a growing tapestry of unexplained observations that made the disappearance uniquely perplexing. Eventually the search was suspended, leaving officials and volunteers alike with a profound sense of incompleteness, as if the lake had quietly swallowed a single day and its witness without leaving a trace. Official reports indicate that after weeks of effort, no credible leads remained. The missing hiker's personal belongings were secured at a nearby ranger station, yet no tangible clue emerged to explain what had occurred. Public statements were cautious, acknowledging only the unresolved nature of the case, while private discussions among staff revealed a shared unease over the lack of closure. Even months later, visitors to Moraine Lake spoke of an unsettling quiet, a subtle awareness that the water and surrounding peaks held secrets beyond observation, the memory of the disappearance lingering in the collective consciousness. Photographers, hikers and guides recounted the feeling of being watched, or the impression that the lake itself resisted full comprehension. The missing hiker became a reference point in discussions among mountaineers, park staff, and researchers concerned with the strange intersections of human activity and unexplained natural phenomena in Banff. The story persisted, quietly woven into the park's rich tapestry of history, yet with no resolution in sight. The lake's glassy surface returned to calm, yet beneath its placid exterior, a mystery remained, untouched and unspoken, waiting silently for answers that might never come. The Kruger National Park research team split. Sunlight struck the ochre earth of Kruger National Park in sharp, unexpected patterns, as if highlighting a trail that no one would ever follow, and somewhere along that path a member of the research team vanished without a trace. The team, composed of experienced wildlife biologists and field assistants, had been monitoring predator-prey interactions in one of the park's least travelled savanna sectors. The disappearance did not happen during a storm or under difficult terrain. It occurred under calm skies with clear visibility and the familiar sounds of birds and distant elephants filling the air. Yet, within minutes, an ordinary day transformed into an enduring mystery. The field team had divided according to standard protocols, each subgroup tasked with distinct observational duties, yet that routine split became the precise moment when ordinary expectations collapsed into uncertainty. One pair had moved toward a small waterhole to record lion behavior, while another group focused on tracking zebra herds along the ridges. The missing member had been assigned a solo survey to measure soil and vegetation variables along a marked transect, a routine task that had been repeated hundreds of times in previous seasons. At first, it seemed the separation was harmless, but the plan that day inadvertently set the stage for the inexplicable. By midday, radios fell silent, and the rhythmic chatter of record-keeping and animal notes gave way to an eerie emptiness that spread across the savannah like an invisible fog. The missing tracker had been expected to check in at regular intervals, yet each scheduled radio call went unanswered. Attempts to reach them by repeating frequencies and switching channels produced only static. Even the experienced field team, familiar with dead zones and signal interference, felt a growing unease as silence replaced routine communication. Something about the absence did not align with the geography, weather, or timing, creating an invisible tension that refused to be ignored. Immediate attempts to retrace steps relied on familiar landmarks, termite mounds, the bends of dry riverbeds, and ancient baobabs, but the terrain offered no clues and no sign that anyone had passed through. Searchers examined the sandy soil for footprints, scanned the sparse tree cover, and even approached waterholes where animals frequently left tracks, but nothing suggested the missing member had ventured far. The landscape, normally generous in evidence, remained stubbornly opaque, leaving investigators to confront the impossible, a disappearance in plain sight. This paradox would become central to the case, and a source of persistent frustration for years to come. The park's ecosystem, usually a source of insight for trackers, provided paradoxes instead. Tracks that appeared momentarily then vanished, bird calls that fell strangely silent, and predators behaving in uncharacteristic ways. Elephants crossed paths in ways that hinted at recent human presence, yet no trace of boots or equipment could be found. Lions and hyenas, typically vocal when encountering intruders, remained oddly absent in the area of the disappearance. Even the smaller creatures, monitor lizards, vervet monkeys and jackals, acted as though nothing had happened, moving through the environment with an uncanny indifference to the event that had disrupted the human visitor's understanding. Team dynamics, once routine and confident, now fractured under pressure. Subtle miscommunications about timing and direction magnified the sense that the disappearance had occurred in a space where rules no longer applied. Some members doubted their own observations, questioning whether they had noted every shift in the environment accurately. The stress of coordinating an immediate response, alongside concerns for safety, created tense interactions and isolated efforts, leaving the team more fragmented than usual. Even seasoned biologists found themselves navigating not just the landscape, but the emotional weight of uncertainty, wondering how a disappearance could happen without warning, without sound, and without a trace. Observers on ridgelines noted minor, inexplicable phenomena, shadows that shifted without a source, distant rustlings with no origin, and fleeting glimpses that were gone before anyone could focus on them. Scattered binocular sightings produced conflicting reports. One claimed to see a figure among acacia trees, while another saw only empty terrain. The anomalies were subtle yet persistent, reinforcing the sense that the environment itself had been altered by some invisible presence. Every glance, every sound became a potential clue, though each eventually dissolved into ambiguity, leaving investigators suspended between careful observation and deepening mystery. Searches intensified, encompassing both methodical ground sweeps and aerial surveys, yet every route and vantage point reaffirmed the same unnerving reality. Nothing, not a footprint or discarded item, marked the missing person's path. Helicopter overflights traced the same ridges repeatedly, and teams on motorbikes combed sandbars and ridgelines for evidence of human passage. Dogs trained in tracking showed brief interest near the transect, but quickly lost scent, as though the trail had been erased. The combination of methodical effort and complete absence of results confounded all expectations, and cemented the event as one of the park's most perplexing unsolved disappearances. Documentation accumulated in parallel with frustration. Logbooks, radio records, and official reports preserved meticulous detail while simultaneously highlighting the absence of any evidence that might solve the mystery. Notes about weather conditions, animal sightings, and team movements contrasted sharply with the lack of tangible proof regarding the missing member's location. Every report reinforced the bizarre nature of the case, producing more questions than answers and fostering speculation among park management, research colleagues, and the wider public. It became clear that conventional explanations, animal attack, accident, or voluntary departure, did not fully account for the circumstances. Weeks later, the remaining team returned to routine observations, but the park itself seemed to retain a memory of the lost member, every rustle of grass and distant roar a reminder of the one who had disappeared amid the ordinary rhythms of the bushveld. Even as daily work continued and wildlife surveys resumed, there remained an unspoken awareness among researchers that the event had left a permanent mark, invisible yet undeniable. The bushveld's vast openness, normally a source of reassurance, now carried a lingering tension, an unsettled silence threaded through the golden grasses and acacia groves. In the vast expanse of Kruger, one presence lingers unseen, leaving the land itself to guard a secret that no search could unravel. Denali's missing climber above Kahiltna Glacier. Denali rises from the Alaska Range as North America's tallest peak, a white fortress of ice and wind that draws climbers from around the world and, at times, stubbornly refuses to give back those who venture too far into its heights. In late May 2024, 3 experienced climbers, all seasoned in high-altitude ascents, made their way up Denali's treacherous slopes toward the summit, traversing the stark expanse known as the Kahiltna Glacier, a vast ribbon of shifting crevasses and snowfields that climbers must cross long before they reach the mountain's steeper inclines. The glacier itself stretches nearly 44 miles from the summit down to base camp, marked by hidden icefalls and snow bridges that can collapse under a single misstep, creating hazards invisible to even the most careful eye. The group's journey unfolded like so many mountaineering efforts on Denali, marked by ice axes, crampons, and the relentless pursuit of elevation. But as they neared the summit, conditions turned against them with sudden winds and dense cloud layers that made navigation nearly impossible. Their planned summit bid brought them onto the football field plateau, an icy stretch perched near 19,600 feet above sea level, a place where the air is thin and the margin for error vanishes with every gust. Temperatures there can plunge well below -40, and wind gusts have been recorded exceeding 100 miles per hour, reducing visibility to mere feet and making even short excursions into the open terrain life-threatening. When the high-altitude helicopter pilot finally reached the altitude with a short-haul rescue basket, under barely safe conditions, it became clear the situation had deteriorated far beyond a simple change in weather. One climber, 47 years old, was spotted and lifted into the waiting rescue gear, weak and exhausted but alive, flown down to Kahiltna Base Camp, and then onto a medical facility in Anchorage for treatment. His survival depended not only on timing and luck, but on the brief window of relatively stable weather that allowed the helicopter to reach such extreme altitudes, a window that would not last long enough for all the climbers. What followed, however, cast a long shadow over the rescue. 2 other climbers from the same team had not made it down, and there was no immediate way to reach them through the swirling winds and low visibility. Park personnel later confirmed the remains of one of those climbers, 36 years old, were recovered at the site where the pair had sought shelter in a crude snow cave, his body bearing signs of prolonged exposure to the harsh elements far above the reaches of any regular search party. The other climber's exact location remained uncertain for days, and the chaotic interplay of storm, altitude, and treacherous terrain meant that even the most precise GPS coordinates offered limited guidance to the rescuers. The timeline of events on Denali that week remains both stark and incomplete, in part because the mountaineering season itself, generally running from May through early July, is defined by unpredictable weather that can abruptly halt any effort to reach stranded climbers or survey their last known whereabouts. At least 3 serious search and rescue operations were underway on the mountain that season, with multiple climbers stranded or struggling with frostbite, hypothermia, and fatigue near the higher camps. Each team faced the impossible choice of advancing toward the summit or retreating to safer elevations, knowing that the margin for survival could evaporate in a single whiteout. Denali's Kahiltna Glacier, the vast feature that climbers must cross and recross during their ascent, is a landscape of paradoxes, expansive yet labyrinthine, marked by tracks and camps that can vanish overnight under drifting snow and ice, leaving little trace of even the most well-prepared expedition. In many Denali incidents over the years, footprints, tents and gear have been found scattered, or sometimes not at all, across areas that the climbers were known to have passed, underscoring how quickly this terrain can erase the steps of those who traverse it. In this case, only fleeting evidence of the missing climbers' progress remained, fleeting tracks that disappeared into wind-scoured ice, leaving rescuers with fragments of their path and no certainty of the final moments. In this case, the climbers were not alone in their experience with Denali's extremes. Other incidents recorded by mountaineering rangers and park officials show how sudden weather changes and hidden crevasses can confound search efforts, leaving those tasked with finding missing climbers to piece together fragmentary evidence from hardened tracks, abandoned camps, and reports from fellow climbers days after the disappearance. Each crevasse, snow cornice, and steep slope carried the potential to end a climb in silence, and many bodies and pieces of equipment have remained lost for years, swallowed into the mountain's immutable ice. Yet even as experienced mountaineers, the 3 climbers on that May expedition repeatedly encountered the cruel calculus of altitude and isolation that defines Denali's slopes, where survival can hinge on a single decision and where clear conditions one moment can turn an entire ridge into a masked threat the next. Winds and cloud cover delayed both rescue flights and ground teams, forcing critical pauses when every minute mattered to those still above base camp, leaving the climbers to battle exhaustion, frostbite, and dwindling oxygen while the mountain held its breath around them. The surviving climber's account, delivered to rescuers after his descent to Kahiltna, emphasized the desperate hours spent huddled in the snow cave and the gradual fading of his companion into silence and stillness over a span of days, an absence that no one could fully explain beyond the brutal arithmetic of cold, altitude, and exhaustion at nearly 20,000 feet on North America's highest mountain. He recalled the disorienting way the ice and snow seemed to shift beneath him, and how the sun, when briefly visible, reflected off the glacier in blinding, ghostly patterns that could disorient even the most experienced eye. Denali itself, a peak revered and feared, now shelters the last moments of an experienced mountaineer whose disappearance above the Kahiltna Glacier resists simple explanation. A reminder that even the most documented climbs can end in questions that echo among the crevasses long after the snow settles. The mountain keeps its own records in ice and wind, impervious to human understanding, leaving behind only partial evidence, fleeting signs, and a sense that some journeys end not with discovery, but with lingering uncertainty. One set of footprints led upward into the clouds above the Kahiltna Glacier, and then they simply vanished. The Snowdonia Park map that didn't match. A hiker set out across Snowdonia with a carefully plotted route in hand, unaware that the map itself would become part of the mystery surrounding their disappearance. The trail they chose traced well-known stone walls, narrow ridges, and undulating hills that had been navigated by generations of walkers. Yet what seemed a routine trek quickly became inexplicable. Even for a seasoned hiker, the intersection of mapped terrain, GPS guidance, and natural obstacles could become disorienting, and within hours the familiar paths began to feel unfamiliar, their certainty subtly undermined by the very tools meant to ensure safety. Equipped with experience and confidence, the hiker moved along trails marked by cairns and occasional signposts, trusting that years of mapped paths could guide them safely through the hills. Local topography was uneven but predictable, with valleys that funneled small streams, ridges that dropped sharply into gorges, and rocky outcrops offering vantage points for orientation. The hiker followed established walking routes connecting remote sections of the park, a network long documented in official maps and guidebooks, yet despite preparation, subtle irregularities in elevation and spacing created a dissonance between what was expected and what was encountered. Underfoot, the terrain alternated between loose scree and solid rock, creating a rhythm of precarious steps that demanded constant attention and tested even practiced hikers. Slopes were deceptive, often appearing gentler from a distance than they truly were, and hidden patches of wet moss or gravel could send a foot sliding in a fraction of a second. Though the day was mild and the weather unremarkable, the hiker's senses were occupied by the minute variations in footing and gradient, the small details that could determine whether a stride landed securely or resulted in a stumble. The forested sections were equally misleading, with twisted roots and fallen branches camouflaging uneven soil, making measured progress difficult even on well-trodden paths. The GPS device in their pack provided a precise set of coordinates, yet when compared to the official search maps later, the two sets of data diverged in ways that puzzled authorities. The device indicated a position several hundred meters from the path shown on the map, in a direction that should have been inaccessible to someone following marked trails. Initial theories considered user error, low battery or magnetic interference, but the unit itself appeared fully functional when recovered. The contradiction suggested that either the device or the mapped coordinates failed to reflect reality accurately, creating a puzzle that would perplex searchers long after the hiker vanished. Teams scoured the area, following ridgelines and scanning valleys, but footprints stopped abruptly, and small traces of equipment were discovered in locations that seemed to defy the expected route. Ropes and trekking poles left behind hinted at an intentional pause or a brief moment of shelter, yet the surrounding terrain offered no natural cover from the elements. Searchers described the discovery of these items as disquieting. They were neither far from the trail nor clearly along an alternate path, as if the hiker had moved through a layer of the landscape unseen by those who arrived hours later. Searchers quickly noted inconsistencies, paths that led to empty hollows, disturbed foliage where no human should have passed, and terrain that seemed to twist perception in subtle, disorienting ways. A narrow ridge showed a set of footprints that abruptly ended at a cluster of stones, while a gentle slope nearby displayed faint marks suggesting movement against gravity, impossible to explain without invoking either misjudged footing or something more unusual. Each anomaly compounded the sense of dislocation, making a well-documented park feel less like a familiar landscape and more like a terrain resisting comprehension. Even familiar landmarks appeared transformed as the day progressed, with changing light angles and shifting shadows making stone cairns and tree stumps seem otherworldly in proportion and placement. By late afternoon, shadows stretched across hollows in ways that obscured depressions and created false paths, while ridges glimmered in a manner that seemed to shift subtly as the sun lowered. Search teams noted that areas they had confidently mapped in the morning looked different just hours later, intensifying the sense that the hiker had vanished from a space where the terrain itself was deceptively mutable. Efforts to reconcile the GPS logs with the mapped trails produced only more questions, revealing a landscape whose contours and elevations created discrepancies beyond ordinary cartographic error. Each coordinate plotted against the map seemed to drift in small but cumulative ways, suggesting that either the digital record or the physical map misrepresented the terrain. Attempts to trace the hiker's intended route often led to dead ends or locations inconsistent with previous observations. For authorities and volunteers alike, the terrain became an almost abstract puzzle, where the laws of navigation seemed to falter. As the hours passed, the hiker's absence became a mounting concern, leaving a trail of contradictions that neither maps, instruments, nor careful observation could fully resolve. Communications between search teams highlighted growing confusion, with different groups reporting conflicting positions of discovered gear and tracks. Witness statements from other walkers were equally puzzling, noting a lack of any trace where the hiker should have passed, yet occasional sightings of movement in improbable locations. The accumulated anomalies created a sense that the disappearance was less about human error and more about the park itself concealing its secrets. The park's hills, quiet and unyielding, seemed to hold their own account of the day's events, keeping the truth in crevices, valleys and ridgelines inaccessible to those who sought answers. Even as night fell and search efforts paused, the landscape retained a silent record of the hiker's journey, a presence suggested only by subtle irregularities and the contrast between expected paths and observed reality. The hills, ancient and enduring, gave nothing directly, yet every shadow, every stone out of place, whispered that something had occurred that defied explanation. Amid Snowdonia's mapped and unmapped terrain, the hiker disappeared, leaving behind only a riddle that refused to be solved. Serra da Capivara's archaeological vanishing. The researcher entered Serra da Capivara prepared for weeks of archaeological study, yet the meticulously documented expedition would soon leave a puzzling void in the park's records. The region, recognized for its remarkable prehistoric rock art, stretches across dry sandstone plateaus, labyrinthine gorges, and scattered canyons in northeastern Brazil. The researchers' aim was precise: catalogue and photograph carvings that had survived for millennia, providing insight into the lives of some of the earliest inhabitants of the Americas. Yet, within hours, what had begun as a carefully planned study transformed into an enigma, one that would perplex colleagues, park authorities, and subsequent investigators. They carried notebooks, cameras, and measuring instruments, each piece of equipment essential for capturing the dimensions, colours, and etchings of ancient carvings. Meticulous planning ensured that every photograph corresponded to a catalogue entry, every sketch aligned with GPS coordinates, and every observation could be cross-referenced for accuracy. Colleagues had noted the researchers' disciplined attention to detail, an approach that minimised error and maximised documentation. It was the sort of methodical care that should have safeguarded against mishap, yet the unexpected disappearance suggested that even the most controlled environment could harbour mysteries beyond human understanding. The terrain alternated between expansive sandstone plains and jagged ridges, with narrow gorges and sparse vegetation forming natural barriers at unpredictable intervals. Walking through dry riverbeds, the researcher navigated scattered boulders and steep inclines, each step requiring attention to prevent injury. Even minor deviations in route could alter the day's schedule, yet the researcher maintained a steady pace, pausing to inspect carved panels hidden within recessed shelters or under overhanging cliffs. The sheer variety of microenvironments within the park amplified both the richness of the archaeological record and the difficulty of maintaining continuous observation. Meticulous notes and sketches captured depictions of human figures, hunting scenes, and local fauna, each stroke documenting a fragment of human history preserved in stone. Yet these actions, normally a testament to careful scholarship, became the final trace of the researchers' presence. Each recording session took place in areas both remote and rugged, locations that, though mapped in guides, remained difficult to traverse even for experienced explorers. In these pockets of preserved history, the line between observable fact and subtle mystery blurred, hinting at the delicate interplay between human endeavour and natural concealment. When later reviewing the expedition logs, discrepancies emerged. Certain permits had been amended retroactively, and locations visited appeared in the logs at times inconsistent with the known pace of travel. Minor details, such as the order in which shelters were inspected, or the sequence of photographic documentation, failed to align. Investigators noted that while the researchers' methods were rigorous, the inconsistencies could not be explained by clerical oversight alone. These anomalies amplified the mystery, suggesting that the disappearance was not merely an accident of terrain but a disruption within the otherwise controlled environment of scientific documentation. Park rangers and colleagues began retracing every step through labyrinthine rock formations and dry riverbeds, yet the evidence offered only fragments. A few scattered footprints, impressions in sandy soil, and a partially open notebook hinted at prior presence but did not explain the researchers' ultimate fate. Each path led to locations that seemed logical on paper, yet revealed nothing in reality. Even when teams coordinated, moving along ridges and into sheltered recesses, the park yielded only silence, preserving its ancient stories while withholding the resolution to a modern enigma. The heat of the sun bore down on sandstone plains, contrasting with cooler shaded canyons where shadows stretched across uneven rock faces. These variations created deceptive illusions of distance and scale, complicating navigation and observation. Even seasoned rangers remarked on how the terrain could make landmarks appear closer or farther than they were, or shift orientation subtly as the day progressed. In such an environment, small errors in estimation or perception could have far-reaching consequences, yet no evidence suggested that the researcher had stumbled or fallen, only that they had ceased to be located within documented parameters. Subtle signs of human movement emerged in isolated pockets. A small pile of stones disturbed, a journal left open atop a boulder, a camera strap lying half buried in dust. Each of these traces hinted at the researcher's prior passage without revealing a coherent path forward. The park, ancient and enduring, seemed to absorb these markers as if acknowledging human presence while simultaneously concealing the outcomes of those who traversed its hidden spaces. For colleagues and investigators, these fragments became points of tension, fragments of a narrative that refused to resolve neatly. Despite detailed reconstructions of the day's work, the researcher remained absent. Investigators cross-referenced logs, GPS data, and recorded observations, yet no sequence accounted for the disappearance. Each hypothesis, misdirection, accident, voluntary withdrawal, founded against the immovable fact that nothing within the documented terrain explained a sudden absence. The contradiction between methodical planning and the inexplicable vanishing underscored the park's enigmatic character, a landscape rich in human history, yet capable of erasing those who attempt to navigate it in modern times. Every boulder, crevice, and rock shelter seemed to hold a memory silently, preserving traces of human activity while guarding the mystery of what had occurred. The park itself became both witness and participant, an enduring presence in which time and human intentions seemed to diverge. Those searching or studying the site were confronted not only with the physical challenges of remote archaeology, but with the sense that the land itself could withhold explanation, leaving observers to reconcile careful records with an unaccountable absence. Within the mapped and unmapped sites of Serra da Capivara, the researcher disappeared, leaving only walls of stone to record their absence. The Rocky Mountain National Park backcountry case. A seasoned outdoorsman entered the backcountry of Rocky Mountain National Park with a permit in hand, yet official records would later obscure his presence, turning what should have been a routine solo excursion into a lingering mystery. The park's vast wilderness stretches from dense pine forest to alpine meadows and rugged ridgelines, a network of trails both maintained and wild, where even experienced hikers can find themselves disoriented. On this day, the hikers' intentions were straightforward: complete a familiar loop, observe the seasonal wildlife, and document the backcountry terrain. Yet, as hours passed, what began as careful preparation dissolved into an inexplicable absence that would baffle authorities for months. He had navigated the park before, relying on maps, topographic guides, and experience to traverse steep slopes, hidden gullies, and elevated ridges. Carrying a GPS unit, compasses, and essential survival gear, he embodied the meticulousness of a seasoned outdoorsman who treated the wilderness with respect, but also assumed a level of control over the environment. His pack contained extra food, layers for sudden weather changes, and a satellite messenger device. Every item had been accounted for, every precaution carefully considered, yet these measures proved insufficient against the unknown forces that would intervene. The route wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine and aspen, where light dappled the forest floor, and along narrow ridgelines that dropped sharply into hidden valleys. Small streams sliced through the terrain, forming channels that could conceal subtle signs of passage or disrupt travel without warning. Rocky outcrops and fallen logs created natural obstacles, requiring constant attention to footing and route selection. Even minor missteps could result in injury, yet the outdoorsman moved deliberately, marking his way with careful attention to distance, pace, and orientation. The wilderness itself was silent but watchful, holding secrets in plain view that only became apparent when something went missing. As he progressed, he checked maps and the GPS unit repeatedly, adjusted his pack, and paused at high points to survey the surrounding landscape. He observed animal tracks, listened for distant rushing water, and noted the orientation of ridges and valleys, as though mapping both the terrain and his own understanding of it. Despite these precautions, subtle anomalies began to appear, trail markers that seemed displaced, broken twigs in areas he knew to be undisturbed, and impressions in the soil that suggested prior movement inconsistent with the park's documented routes. Even the way sunlight struck certain ridges appeared altered, giving familiar areas a strange sense of unfamiliarity. Trail markers appeared altered or missing in places, and faint disturbances in the soil suggested movement, yet nothing fully aligned with expectations. Footprints appeared in sequences that started and stopped abruptly, vanishing behind fallen logs or rocky outcrops, leaving the trail seemingly untravelled. These small but unnerving contradictions heightened the sense that the familiar backcountry was behaving unpredictably, and though nothing overtly dangerous had occurred, the pattern of disappearance was emerging silently, almost imperceptibly, within the terrain itself. The hiker's own confidence in route knowledge became a fragile reassurance, tested by subtle discrepancies in the path. Once his absence was reported, search teams and volunteers combed meadows, canyons, ridgelines, and streambeds, scouring the backcountry systematically yet cautiously. Despite their efforts, official records remained incomplete, and his permit curiously did not appear in public logs, complicating coordination and leaving gaps in the sequence of documented movements. Teams methodically retraced every step he was known to have taken, yet no trace was found that could account for the sudden vanishing, and the wilderness seemed to swallow clues as quickly as they were discovered. Temporary shelters and campsites were checked thoroughly, and even areas rarely frequented by hikers were scoured, revealing nothing but the enduring stillness of the forest. The weather shifted unpredictably, with gusts of wind rustling pine needles, clouds obscuring high ridges, and shadows stretching and shifting across steep slopes. Birds cried from distant branches, and small mammals scurried through the undergrowth. Yet these signs of life offered no indication of human presence. The park's quietness amplified these subtle cues, making familiar areas appear different from one pass to the next. Searchers often described feeling disoriented, their sense of scale and distance skewed by the slopes and gullies, a reminder that even carefully charted wilderness retains a capacity for confusion. Isolation compounded these challenges, and each hour the hiker remained missing heightened both concern and unease. Investigators observed partially buried gear, a disturbed backpack strap, and footprints that ended abruptly in dense undergrowth. These fragments offered no logical explanation, but raised more questions. Had he sought shelter, been diverted by terrain, or encountered a hazard invisible to those retracing his steps? Each clue was meticulously documented, yet none led to a resolution. Even familiar features of the landscape, such as small ledges and hidden hollows, seemed capable of hiding the smallest evidence, amplifying the sense that the forest itself could withhold truth. Logs, maps, and witness accounts provided conflicting details, creating an investigative dead end. Some reports placed him at certain landmarks at specific times, while GPS data suggested minor deviations that could not be reconciled. Even the hiker's experience and preparation could not account for the sudden absence, and the patchwork of partial evidence only amplified the sense of incomprehensibility. The wilderness was at once a familiar terrain to those trained in navigation, and a domain capable of erasing a person from its narrative without leaving an explanation. The backcountry itself seemed to absorb the event, its forests, ridges, streams, and meadows silently retaining the memory of passage while denying clarity. Those who searched felt the tension of anticipation without resolution, scanning the landscape for signs that never fully materialized. Despite meticulous reconstruction of his path, careful coordination of search teams, and repeated surveys, the disappearance remained unsolved. The forest and ridges seemed to preserve an invisible record, leaving observers with only speculation and fragments of what had occurred. In the shadowed backcountry of the Rockies, the hiker vanished without a trace, leaving the forest to silently guard its secrets. Mount Elgon's borderland disappearance. Clouds clung to the jagged volcanic ridges of Mount Elgon, drifting along the Kenya-Uganda border, as a climber vanished without explanation, leaving officials with conflicting reports and lingering uncertainty. The highland wilderness stretches across steep slopes, bamboo forests and hidden ravines, a landscape both beautiful and unforgiving, where human activity can disappear almost as quickly as it appears. Small waterfalls cascaded into narrow gullies, their roar muffled by the dense bamboo, while moss-coated rocks glistened from recent rainfall. This climber, experienced and meticulous, had prepared extensively for the journey, yet the borderland itself seemed to conspire with the environment, erasing footprints and creating an absence that puzzled even the most seasoned authorities. Experienced in highland climbs, he carried ropes, harnesses, and survival equipment, having mapped a route through volcanic slopes and dense bamboo thickets that few adventurers had attempted in recent years. Each element of his plan had been carefully considered: provisions for sudden weather changes, a waterproof map, and layered clothing suited for humid mornings and cool nights. He checked his pack repeatedly, adjusting straps and testing knots, ensuring that every tool was functional. His route combined observation of known landmarks with exploration of less travelled sections of the mountain, creating a balance between safety and adventure that now seemed irrelevant in the face of his disappearance. The mountains rose sharply, cliffs and waterfalls concealed by drifting clouds, while caves and narrow ravines threaded the slopes, each step demanding careful attention to footing and terrain. Streams carved through volcanic rock, shifting with recent rain, while hidden gullies amplified the echoes of distant birds and water. The environment's natural beauty masked treacherous features. Loose volcanic rock, slippery moss, and uneven soil made navigation slow and exacting. Even for someone familiar with highland climbs, the terrain required constant vigilance, where one misjudged step could leave a lasting mark or vanish without notice. He paused repeatedly to examine moss-covered rocks, listen to water cascading through hidden channels, and observe animal activity, unaware that subtle anomalies in the landscape were already complicating his passage. Tracks that should have been linear twisted unexpectedly, fallen branches obscured small paths, and stones displaced by past rainfall hinted at prior movement he could not identify. Birds flitted nervously through bamboo groves as if disturbed by a presence unseen, while the low hum of insects filled the air. Each careful observation offered no warning, yet the mountain was quietly shaping an environment where even the most methodical progress could become disoriented. Conflicting accounts emerged. Kenyan authorities reported one set of coordinates and timing, while Ugandan officials issued a different version, each contradicting the other and leaving local authorities unsure where to focus their efforts. The border itself, invisible to those on the ground, became an unintentional obstacle. Logs and radio transmissions were sometimes inconsistent, reflecting overlapping jurisdictional control and unclear lines of responsibility. Even confirming the last known location proved difficult, as small inconsistencies in reporting created gaps in the timeline, amplifying the mystery of what had happened on the slopes. Teams from both nations combed steep ridges, bamboo groves and concealed caves, yet dense vegetation and uneven slopes concealed nearly all traces of movement, frustrating attempts to reconstruct the route. Ridges that appeared navigable from a distance were cut by hidden gullies, and bamboo thickets proved nearly impenetrable, forcing searchers to move cautiously and slowly. Footprints might appear and disappear in mud or on volcanic scree, leaving only fleeting evidence of progress. Hours passed, and even the most systematic sweeps yielded little beyond broken foliage, faint impressions, and the quiet sounds of the highland wilderness, which offered more questions than answers. Heavy rainfall soaked the forest floor, and drifting clouds reshaped the shadows across volcanic peaks, sending sounds bouncing through hidden gullies and amplifying the sense of isolation and unpredictability. Streams swelled with runoff, washing away minor tracks and blurring prior impressions, while birds' calls echoed unpredictably through bamboo groves. The combination of terrain, weather, and limited visibility created conditions in which even experienced climbers could vanish without a trace, leaving observers to struggle with both environmental and logistical confusion. Eyewitnesses offered conflicting recollections. One reported seeing a figure descending a cliff. Another described footprints near a waterfall, yet these observations failed to align with official timelines or with each other. Villagers and hikers in nearby settlements described fleeting glimpses, mistaking shapes for people or animals, yet the lack of consistency reinforced the mystery. Each report, however small or contradictory, became part of an incomplete puzzle, leaving those trying to understand the disappearance with a sense of unease and frustration at the mountain's inscrutability. Even minor signs, like disturbed bamboo shoots or footprints partially obscured by soil, became tantalizing hints rather than solutions. Officials faced contradictory evidence, incomplete logs, and jurisdictional confusion, revealing how procedural gaps and political boundaries compounded the already perplexing mystery of the climber's disappearance. Communications between the Kenyan and Ugandan teams were inconsistent, and records of permits and prior routes offered no clear picture. Attempts to reconcile timelines and coordinates only highlighted the inconsistencies, making each official report a piece of an unsolved riddle. The borderland wilderness had taken the climber, and no bureaucratic effort could restore him. Mount Elgon itself remained indifferent, its volcanic slopes, bamboo forests, and hidden ravines quietly preserving the memory of someone who had vanished within its wilderness. Time and weather erased traces, and the terrain held its secrets as firmly as the border divided the nations below. The mountain, a living monument to natural power, observed the human absence silently, recording it in some imperceptible way beyond the reach of any map, log, or coordinated effort. Even the smallest creek or ridge seemed to guard a fragment of the climber's final movements. Along the shadowed slopes of Mount Elgon, the climber disappeared, leaving the borderland to hold its secrets. The Swiss National Park time gap. The distant toll of cowbells drifted across alpine valleys, yet during the hours that followed, a hiker disappeared without explanation, leaving a puzzling gap in the official timeline. Swiss National Park, with its meticulously maintained trails and well-documented routes, should have made such a disappearance nearly impossible. The hiker had been experienced, aware of the risks, and expected to follow a clearly marked path. Yet somewhere between one observation point and the next, the trail itself seemed to erase him, leaving only a void in the official record and a lingering unease among those tasked with tracking his journey. Equipped with maps, GPS, and a meticulous plan, the hiker had charted a course along familiar trails and secluded ridges, confident that every step would be documented. His pack contained layers for sudden cold, a compact first aid kit, and provisions for multiple days, as well as a journal meant to record both observations and coordinates. He checked his devices regularly, comparing readings with the printed map, trusting the precision of Swiss technology. Each step was calculated, yet as he moved, the park seemed to challenge the reliability of both planning and instruments, leaving invisible gaps in time that no device could reconcile. Pine forests swayed gently in the breeze, streams gurgled over stones, and distant peaks shimmered with melting snow, each element ordinary yet subtly indifferent to the mystery unfolding. Birds flitted between branches, and wildflowers clung to rocky slopes, giving the impression of a landscape entirely in order. Even the sounds of distant water and rustling trees seemed routine, normal, as if the natural world were oblivious to the human disappearance that would soon confound every record. The park's serene beauty made the absence more pronounced, emphasizing the contrast between ordinary perception and the anomalous event hidden within. Footprints appeared and disappeared without explanation. A water bottle lay half buried in grass, and small animals seemed unsettled by an unseen presence moving through their habitat. Moss-covered stones bore no marks of recent passage, while a snapped twig hinted at motion that could not be accounted for. Each subtle irregularity suggested human presence, yet simultaneously denied confirmation. The hiker's route, normally predictable, became a patchwork of partial traces and fleeting signs, as if time itself had skipped or deferred observation of his journey. Official logs recorded hours with no movement, while GPS points contradicted ranger patrols, creating a temporal puzzle that left even seasoned park officials uneasy. One set of coordinates suggested the hiker had been on a ridge at 11:30 a.m., while a patrol reported observing no one in that location until hours later. Permit logs showed that he had begun the hike on schedule, but entries from subsequent checkpoints offered no coherent record. The resulting dissonance created a timeline in which the hiker's movements could not be fully reconciled, leaving a gap that neither logic nor technology could resolve. Volunteers combed meadows and forested slopes, noting that all visible trails were empty, as if the hiker had stepped into the park's carefully maintained order and simply dissolved. The grass remained unbroken beyond a short distance, and streams bore no new disturbances. Even areas where hikers might leave faint impressions offered only ambiguous signs, flattened vegetation, displaced leaves, but nothing substantial. The human absence contrasted starkly with the meticulous documentation for which Swiss National Park is known, reinforcing a sense of unreality in the midst of meticulous natural order. Fog rolled in unexpectedly, shifting patterns of light and shadow, while sudden gusts carried the scent of pine and wet earth, temporarily obscuring trails that had been clear moments before. Visibility fluctuated across meadows and ridges, making the already uncertain path even harder to interpret. Small animal tracks were quickly erased or redirected, while the hiker's own movements were concealed beneath the natural rearrangement of flora and terrain. Though brief, the fog added a layer of disorientation, enhancing the sense that ordinary measures of observation were failing in a park famed for precision and predictability. Hikers in nearby valleys reported fleeting glimpses of a figure, yet the locations and times did not match any recorded coordinates or ranger observations. A woman descending a path saw someone pausing by a small stream, only to later find the GPS indicated that the hiker had already passed the same location hours earlier. Another hiker recalled catching a glimpse of a dark jacket moving among trees, yet patrol logs recorded no such presence. These inconsistencies only deepen the sense that ordinary measures, both technological and human, could not capture what had transpired. GPS readings, permit logs, and patrol notes failed to align, revealing that even in a park defined by precision, anomalies could defy expectation and erase certainty. Every attempt to reconstruct the hiker's journey encountered contradictions: checkpoint times that overlapped impossibly, coordinates that suggested movement faster than terrain would allow, and physical traces that appeared and vanished with no explanation. The precision that Swiss National Park is known for only heightened the mystery, emphasizing the impossibility of reconciling ordinary order with the anomalous lapse in time. Alpine silence returned, undisturbed and absolute, with only the missing hours lingering, a void that technology, observation, and human reasoning could not penetrate. Trails remained unbroken, streams flowed steadily, and wildlife returned to their routine behaviors, indifferent to the gap in recorded events. Even the wind seemed to carry a quiet awareness of the anomaly, brushing through pine needles without disturbing them. The hiker's disappearance remained a temporal void, a space in which ordinary expectations of observation and causality failed, leaving only unanswered questions. Within the silent reaches of the Swiss National Park, a few hours vanished without a trace, and the mountains hold the answers that no map or clock could provide. Fiordland National Park's unfinished logbook. A small hut perched on the edge of Fiordland's remote wilderness held a leather-bound logbook, its last entries ending in abrupt silence that hinted at the hiker's unexplained vanishing. The structure was modest, built of weathered timber and nestled against a backdrop of cliffs and cascading waterfalls, seemingly ordinary yet impossible to ignore in the stillness of the dense forest. Moss grew thick on the roof, and the woods smelled faintly of damp pine and rain-soaked earth. Rangers had found it while retracing the hiker's intended route, and although every item inside remained undisturbed, the absence of the person it chronicled transformed the logbook into an eerie artifact, holding questions with no answers. The solo trekker had meticulously planned a route through valleys, rivers, and steep ridges, carrying permits and provisions intended to account for every foreseeable challenge. Maps and compass readings were double-checked each morning, while notes about daily distances and expected rest points were neatly recorded in the logbook. Even small details such as water sources and potential bivouac sites were logged with care. This was no impulsive journey. The hiker was methodical, experienced, and well-equipped for the wilderness of Fiordland, which is renowned for both its beauty and its unforgiving isolation. Every precaution made the eventual disappearance all the more baffling. Towering cliffs loomed over cascading waterfalls, while dense forests threaded the valley floor, their shadows shifting with the wind and concealing paths both travelled and forgotten. Moss clung to boulders, and ferns crowded the undergrowth, creating layers of green that obscured both footprints and faint disturbances in the soil. Mist hung low in pockets between trees, condensing into beads of moisture that dripped rhythmically onto the forest floor. The air carried the scent of damp earth and rushing water, while the constant roar of distant cascades masked subtle sounds that might have otherwise drawn attention to movement nearby. Here, the wilderness was simultaneously serene and impenetrable, a natural labyrinth that seemed indifferent to human presence. Early notes in the logbook were ordinary: weather observations, distances covered, and landmarks passed, yet occasional lines hinted at unease, distant sounds, subtle tremors beneath the forest floor, and the fleeting impression of shapes among the trees. The hiker recorded an unusual stillness in certain valleys, noting that birds and small mammals seemed to vanish before being observed directly. While nothing overtly dangerous was written, these subtle impressions suggested a sense of being watched, or of environmental conditions that were not fully understood. They were observations that would only gain significance once the hiker had disappeared. One page stopped mid-sentence, the ink fading where thought was left unfinished, leaving a pause heavier than any explanation or map could convey. The abrupt halt was startling in a logbook otherwise full of orderly entries, as if the author had been interrupted mid-thought or mid-gesture, never returning to complete the record. Rangers and investigators noted that no other pages showed similar omissions, giving the incomplete sentence an unsettling weight, a marker of a human presence suddenly halted in time and space. Outside, footprints began at the door but disappeared into dense underbrush, while a broken branch suggested movement that the surrounding terrain could not account for. Soil depressions and flattened ferns hinted at hurried steps, yet the path seemed to dissolve after only a few meters. Small animal tracks crossed some of these impressions, but did nothing to clarify direction or intention. Nearby, a shallow creek reflected fragmented light from the overcast sky, its banks disturbed in a pattern that seemed deliberate yet not explainable. It was as if the forest had selectively erased evidence, leaving behind tantalizing hints that both confirmed and denied the presence of the missing hiker. Rangers reached the hut hours later, finding the logbook intact but the hiker absent, with no sign of struggle and only the forest's indifferent sounds filling the void. Every effort to locate the individual led only to familiar trails, unbroken terrain, and echoes of waterfalls that obscured the faintest noises. The isolation of the region compounded the mystery. Despite thorough examination of the surrounding area, no additional signs of movement or habitation were discovered. Small glacial streams shimmered under muted light, and wind-driven rain swept through the canopy, but no clues appeared. It was a disappearance that left even trained personnel questioning the limits of observation in Fiordland's vast wilderness. Locals reported fleeting glimpses of a figure near nearby streams, while others claimed the area had remained undisturbed, leaving investigators unable to reconcile the contradictions. Some spoke of seeing a lone silhouette navigating cliffside paths, others described untouched undergrowth, as if no one had passed at all. These inconsistencies deepened the sense of anomaly, hinting that what appeared simple and traceable on paper defied both memory and physical evidence when encountered in the park itself. The conflicting testimonies lent the event an almost folkloric quality, though grounded entirely in verified sightings and park records. Efforts to piece together the hiker's path from log entries, environmental traces, and witness statements only deepened the uncertainty, revealing gaps that neither reason nor technology could bridge. GPS coordinates, when referenced against landmarks in the logbook, created contradictions in time and distance, while search reports suggested intervals of absence that were impossible to account for, given the terrain's known difficulty. The meticulous record-keeping that should have ensured safety instead highlighted the failure of observation, making the forest seem both precise and unpredictable at once. The hut stood silent, framed by the shadows of ancient trees and distant waterfalls, a reminder that some journeys leave traces only in questions, not answers. The logbook, upright on its shelf, seemed almost to insist that the story was incomplete, a fragment of human observation halted abruptly by circumstances that could not be explained. The surrounding forest, dark and unyielding, waited without interference, leaving the disappearance unresolved and the entries suspended in a tension that extended beyond the pages themselves. Even the dripping of water from the eaves felt weighted, as if the forest marked time differently where the hiker had vanished. In the depths of Fiordland, the logbook's final words remained suspended in silence, as if the forest itself chose to finish the tale. The Cairngorms Plateau Walker Case. Stone markers jutted from the frost-hardened ground, their edges chipped by time, and somewhere among them, a walker vanished without a trace. The plateau stretched in every direction, deceptively uniform, with only cairns and ridges breaking its monotony. Despite the open space, navigation was a constant challenge. Subtle depressions and shallow snowdrifts masked familiar features. Local guides noted that even in good conditions, a single misstep or misjudged landmark could leave a hiker disoriented. This disappearance, however, had occurred on a well-travelled section of the Cairngorms, marked and mapped, yet the walker simply ceased to exist in any observable way. Maps lay folded in the hiker's pack, meticulously planned, yet familiarity with the Cairngorms offered no guarantee against the plateau's hidden perils. The individual was experienced, having completed multiple long-distance treks across Scotland's highlands and carried standard safety equipment, GPS devices, emergency supplies, and layered clothing suited for sudden temperature drops. Notes in a small journal recorded expected distances, estimated rest stops, and navigational checkpoints, evidence of careful preparation. Yet, as rescuers later discovered, even the most methodical planning could not predict what the plateau would obscure from human sight. Faint echoes of distant wildlife were swallowed by the emptiness of the high plateau, leaving only sudden shifts in snow depth to hint at movement. Grouse and mountain hares occasionally darted across open stretches, their paths unrelated to human passage, yet their sudden appearances heightened the sense of isolation. The wind carried faint noises from ridges and gullies, masking any subtle signs of a traveller. For the walker, each step across frozen ground offered both progress and uncertainty, with the sense that the plateau itself could erase or redirect evidence of presence. A bootprint pressed into a shallow drift seemed ordinary at first, yet no continuation appeared for dozens of meters, as if the trail itself had dissolved. Nearby stones showed scuff marks, suggesting brief contact with human hands, but no discernible path connected these minor traces. Every footprint that could be followed ended abruptly, leaving searchers to confront the unsettling idea that conventional tracking might fail in this landscape. The sudden absence of continuity in the walker's trail transformed the plateau into a puzzle of invisible forces, or at least forces that human eyes and logic could not decipher. A team of rescuers advanced along intersecting ridges, carefully checking cairns and depressions, but each promising lead ended in emptiness, unclaimed by human presence. Experienced mountain rescue personnel noted the unusual lack of disruption in snow or vegetation that normally accompanies movement. Tracks were inconsistent, some appearing in places impossible given the walker's expected pace. Even using GPS logs, the team could not reconcile the estimated locations with the terrain they observed, leaving intervals of time that appeared to have no explanation. Occasional hikers described glimpsing a figure in the distance, while others who followed the same route saw no one at all, creating a rift between perception and reality. Those who reported sightings recalled a solitary silhouette moving with deliberate steps only to vanish behind a ridge moments later. Others passed the same ridges without detecting any movement, leaving conflicting accounts. These discrepancies underscored both the plateau's vastness and the difficulty of human observation in such a landscape, where perspective and distance could alter perception entirely. Hidden gullies and sudden rises broke the plateau into confusing segments, and snow bridges over small creeks concealed the ground beneath from prying eyes. What might appear flat and continuous from a distance could conceal obstacles capable of redirecting a walker or erasing footprints. Shallow depressions and patches of ice offered no solid clues, and even the most careful scanning of the terrain produced more questions than answers. Every subtle variation in the ground became a potential explanation, yet none was sufficient to account for the walker's disappearance. Coordinates from last known points and estimated walking speeds failed to match, forcing investigators to confront intervals of time that seemed impossible to reconcile. Analysis of distances and terrain difficulty suggested that the hiker should have reached certain checkpoints, yet no evidence confirmed passage. Observers found gaps in logic between expected routes and documented tracks, raising the possibility that the individual had entered sections of the plateau that left no trace, or that some factor unknown to investigators had intervened. Each inconsistency compounded the mystery, leaving the disappearance unresolved. Equipment was found intact, layers of clothing in place, yet meticulous preparation had no power over the vanishing that had occurred in a section of terrain considered well marked. Backpacks, compasses and GPS devices were all recovered near the starting point of the search, suggesting that the hiker had been mobile and intentional before disappearing. Yet even this evidence offered only a partial understanding. The plateau's peculiar ability to absorb human presence, leaving few discernible markers, emphasized the vulnerability of even the most skilled and careful travelers in the cairngorms. The plateau's harsh geometry, with flat expanses punctuated by rock outcrops, swallowed both sight and certainty, leaving only unanswered questions about the walker's fate. Investigators and searchers alike were forced to confront a landscape that defied conventional mapping and predictive modelling, a space where visibility, footing, and human expectation all proved unreliable. The story of the walker became entwined with the plateau itself, a case where environment and disappearance were inseparable, and where every step seemed to vanish into the vast, indifferent highlands. Among the cairns and unbroken snowfields of the cairngorms, the walker's path ceased abruptly, as though the plateau had quietly claimed them. Yellowstone's Lamar Valley Incident. A leather-bound journal rested on a worn bench, open to a page meticulously filled with careful handwriting, corrections and notations that hinted at both precision and anticipation. Each entry listed times, observation points, and the wildlife the visitor intended to record, yet the writing ended abruptly, as though the author had been interrupted mid-thought. The journal alone became a witness to absence, symbolizing a presence that had existed but now refused to be confirmed. Even the faint indentation of pen strokes on the following page suggested movement without action, a trace of a person who had vanished before finishing a single task. The individual had arrived in Yellowstone with an air of methodical purpose, familiar with both the park's regulations and the layout of the Lamar Valley corridors. Previous trips involved careful study of animal patterns, photography and mapping of trails, demonstrating experience and competence. This visit included high-resolution cameras, a GPS tracker, notebooks, and a vest carefully stocked with supplies, all meant for meticulous observation and personal safety. Nothing about the visitor suggested recklessness, and yet all preparation could not account for a disappearance that would confound even seasoned observers. Equipment left behind included a high-powered spotting scope that had been meticulously aligned, yet its lens captured nothing unusual in the moments leading up to the disappearance. Park staff later noted that the scope had been positioned to monitor a well-known wildlife corridor, one that normally yielded continuous observation data. Photographs taken from the scope's tripod, timestamped just minutes before the disappearance, showed no other humans in the vicinity. Curiously, the viewfinder revealed slight movement in the shadows near the trail, but no figure could be identified. The careful placement of the equipment and the absence of any human interference added to the sense that the visitor had vanished under conditions that defied ordinary explanation. Footprints pressed into the soil, at first clear and deliberate, soon fractured into fragments that defied conventional interpretation. Boot imprints, scuffed dirt, and faint impressions of soles appeared for a few meters, then vanished entirely, leaving unbroken ground in their wake. Some tracks seemed to pause, as if the person had hesitated or been lifted from the earth itself. Minor disturbances of grass and small stones were inconsistent and irregular, puzzling investigators who attempted to retrace each step, only to find gaps that mocked any attempt at explanation. Tourists and visitors nearby recounted glimpses that only deepened uncertainty. One group described a solitary figure moving between observation platforms, while moments later the space was empty. Another recalled hearing snapping twigs, then silence, and a third observed what looked like a shadow across a distant path, which vanished before they could identify it. These reports conflicted in timing, distance, and perception, yet all converged on one unsettling truth. A human presence had been there, and then it had disappeared entirely. Internal ranger logs contained notes that hinted at the anomalies, although many details were conspicuously absent from public records. Notations included time-stamped sketches of footprints, disturbances in soil, and observations of equipment that had been moved slightly without explanation. Some entries even suggested repeated attempts to locate the visitor along known corridors, yet these were never acknowledged in formal reports. The omission of such evidence suggested either procedural caution or a recognition that the incident could not be readily classified, leaving the anomaly to linger in partial documentation. Search efforts were thorough but increasingly perplexing. Teams retraced the visitor's planned route. Using GPS waypoints, maps, and fragmented tracks as guides, observation platforms, corridors, and adjacent paths were systematically scoured, often yielding no trace beyond faint indentations in the soil. Communication between teams highlighted inconsistencies. One group reported a footprint where another had found nothing, and equipment designed to detect movement produced ambiguous signals. Even experienced searchers, accustomed to the valley's rhythms and terrain, found themselves repeatedly confounded. Investigation revealed timing discrepancies and contradictions across multiple sources. Camera checkpoints showed no presence where the visitor was expected, while witness statements suggested activity at precise moments. Attempts to reconcile GPS readings, journal times, and human estimates produced further contradictions, leaving analysts with a series of fragmented and inconclusive data points. Each effort to construct a coherent narrative only emphasized the disappearance's defiance of standard logic and observational methods. Despite the valley's monitored corridors, a person had vanished entirely, illustrating the paradox of visibility and absence. Observation points, signage, and regular human traffic should have provided multiple opportunities to locate or verify the visitor's movements, yet the disappearance revealed how easily human perception and expectation can fail. Even in an environment designed for oversight and safety, ordinary procedures did not explain the sudden erasure of a single presence. Analysts reflected on patterns emerging from similar incidents in monitored locations, yet no complete parallels existed. Reconstructing events relied on incomplete tracks, partial witness memory, and journal entries, producing a puzzle without a solution. The gaps in documentation and conflicting testimonies underscored the fragility of evidence and the limitations of rational analysis in accounting for such an absence. Every map, note, and observation pointed toward ordinary activity, while simultaneously affirming the extraordinary disappearance that occurred within it. Ultimately, the Lamar Valley resumed its normal rhythms, but the incident left a lingering trace of uncertainty. Reports, internal logs, and memory converged into a narrative that refused closure, presenting only the stark reality of absence in a space designed for observation and human engagement. Every corridor, bench, and pathway seemed ordinary, yet each concealed a question that remained unanswered, a reminder that even well-documented areas could harbour the inexplicable. Within the monitored corridors of Lamar Valley, the visitor disappeared completely, leaving only gaps in records and questions that have never been answered. The Dolomites' disappearance with no fall evidence. The climber's boots left neat impressions on the starting ledge, yet no one would ever follow those steps again. Each print suggested confidence, experience, and careful planning. From the base, the route appeared deceptively straightforward, marked with familiar holds and accessible anchors, yet the vertical span carried its own unforgiving complexity. Observers later noted that the first impressions hinted at nothing unusual, only a climber methodically beginning a routine ascent. By the time the route had been scaled halfway, no trace indicated the impossibility that would soon unfold, leaving only the beginning traces of someone who would vanish without a single conventional clue. Ropes were coiled with precision, carabiners clipped methodically, and every piece of gear had been double-checked before the ascent. The climber had prepared for every eventuality, weather shifts, sudden rockfall, and even minor injuries that might arise along the route. Harnesses were snug, gloves were worn for tactile grip, and chalk was carefully applied to the palms and fingertips. Cameras and GPS devices were secured to capture progress, yet each item remained where it should have, untouched, suggesting that nothing, no accidental fall, no misstep, had interrupted the climb. Every precaution highlighted how extraordinary the disappearance would ultimately be. Hands gripped the cold limestone as the climber navigated familiar holds, each movement deliberate and controlled, betraying no hint of misstep. Fingers found cracks, toes balanced on minimal ledges, and every motion reflected extensive experience. The rhythm was precise, almost meditative, as the climber ascended sections that had challenged novices but posed little difficulty to someone of advanced skill. Yet after a brief interval, a pattern emerged. The usual evidence of passage, scuffed rock, displaced gravel, appeared inconsistent, as though the person had moved along the cliff in a manner that left only partial impressions, refusing to conform to known climbing behaviour. A guide stationed below recalled glimpsing a figure halfway up the face, only to find that later no one occupied the space they had just seen. Other climbers, present on nearby routes, reported similar fleeting glimpses, but when attention returned, the figure had vanished entirely. Some described seeing shadows shift along ledges, but the steep angles and distance offered no clarity. These accounts were frustratingly specific yet frustratingly inconclusive, a series of observations that confirmed human presence while simultaneously denying resolution. It became immediately clear that a conventional fall or mishap was unlikely. Anchors that should have carried weight showed no sign of strain, and the surrounding scree remained undisturbed, as though the climber had vanished mid-air without impact. Investigators scrutinized each piece of equipment and each anchor point, finding no signs of tension, sudden snap, or abrasion. The ropes, carefully inspected, remained taut but unused in a manner that suggested they had never borne weight beyond minor adjustments. On ledges where a fall would leave clear evidence, scattered gear, displaced stones, scuff marks, nothing appeared. The absence of a trace contradicted every expectation of gravity, leaving professionals to confront a scenario that defied standard logic. A small journal found at base camp contained meticulous notes about each pitch, including estimated grip friction and anchor tension, yet it ended abruptly without explanation. Investigators pored over the entries, noting that the climber had logged subtle anomalies, loose flakes of limestone, areas of microfracture, and minor deviations in the expected rock texture. These observations suggested heightened awareness of potential hazards, yet no corresponding event was ever recorded. The sudden stop in the journal coincided with the disappearance, leaving a chilling gap between meticulous documentation and total absence. Even more perplexing, personal annotations hinted at unusual shadows and sounds on the cliff, details dismissed as normal by the climber but now hauntingly prescient. Teams ascending the route methodically called out names and scanned ledges, yet the usual traces of human passage, the faint scrape of boots, a dropped glove, were nowhere to be found. Rescuers moved in patterns designed to maximize coverage. One team checked ledges, another examined potential overhangs, and a third traced the base of the cliff. All repeated sweeps produced the same unsettling result. The climber had left almost nothing behind. Observers noted the psychological strain as patterns of expectation. Footprints, loose rocks, rope marks, collapsed into nothing, producing a growing sense of disorientation and unease among the searchers. Logs from the base camp detailed every planned movement, yet when compared to the climber's last known position, gaps of hours appeared with no explanation. Time-stamped photographs, GPS waypoints, and entries in a personal notebook were all consistent up to a point, and then inconsistencies emerged. Cameras at the base and mid-route recorded no passage during expected intervals. Attempts to reconcile data with witness accounts revealed overlapping gaps and ambiguities. Each piece of documentation seemed reliable, yet collectively they suggested a disappearance that conventional timelines could not accommodate. Experts noted that even experienced climbers in monitored routes sometimes disappeared under circumstances that defied ordinary explanation, yet nothing on this ascent matched known cases. Technical climbing incidents normally left clear evidence: fall lines, snapped ropes, personal effects, but here there was none. Comparisons to historical accidents only reinforced the anomaly, leaving investigators with a singular conclusion: the climber had vanished without a trace. The vertical environment amplified the mystery, emphasizing that even expertise and preparation offered no guarantee against unexplained outcomes. Focus and precision had always been the climber's strengths, but investigators wondered how human perception and decision-making could intersect with a disappearance so complete. The climber's repeated habits, checking anchors, measuring distances, pausing to adjust gloves, had all been documented. Yet something disrupted the normal cause and effect chain. A human being who was present and attentive vanished in a space that should have contained undeniable evidence of passage. The psychological weight of such an anomaly lingered among searchers and analysts alike. The cliff face remained unchanged, towering and unyielding, yet somewhere along its vertical span, a person had ceased to exist without a trace. Ledges, crevices, and narrow holds appeared unaltered, defying the expectation that gravity and physicality would reveal what had occurred. Every inspection and repeated sweep confirmed that the disappearance contradicted standard climbing logic. The impossibility itself became the central truth, an absence defined by what should have been visible but was not. High on the Dolomites' sheer cliffs, the climber vanished entirely, leaving only impossibly empty rock and questions that endure to this day. Coley National Park and the missing journalist. At the Coley National Park office, a stack of permits sat neatly on a counter, each one hinting at procedures that would soon prove contradictory. The journalist arrived early that morning, papers in hand and camera slung across a shoulder, intent on documenting environmental policy across the park's protected areas. Staff confirmed access to the designated zones and offered maps, yet subtle discrepancies in the printed trail guides were noted, suggesting changes had been made without formal announcements. From the outset, the park seemed ordinary, but an undercurrent of administrative oddity lingered. The journalist unfolded a detailed itinerary, mapping research objectives and protected areas with precise notes that would later become central to the investigation. Each stop was calculated for maximum observation. Bird nesting sites, wetland boundaries, and human encroachment markers were all catalogued. GPS units were tested, batteries charged, and multiple notebooks stacked in anticipation of field notes. The careful planning underscored a methodical mind, one unlikely to simply vanish without leaving traces. Yet the meticulous preparation would only magnify the mystery that followed. Certain trails and observation points appeared suddenly restricted, their closures unexplained by posted notices or prior correspondence. Sections marked as open in the printed guides were blocked by gates or official signs, sometimes added overnight or without explanation. Colleagues later recalled that the journalist remarked on the closures with mild irritation, noting that the same areas had been accessible in prior visits. These administrative contradictions went unnoticed by outsiders at the time, but in hindsight they formed a subtle, unnerving pattern. On several occasions, the journalist reported encountering new signs and temporary barriers that were not listed on any official map. Rangers who later provided statements noted these barriers had been placed for routine maintenance, yet logs indicated no scheduled work. A series of gates appeared locked one day and open the next, with no record of personnel being present. These anomalies, initially shrugged off as administrative quirks, would later become a focal point in the investigation, suggesting that what was accessible to the journalist was not entirely consistent with what the park itself documented. Records in the administrative ledger showed amendments made after the disappearance, altering timestamps and access permissions without explanation. Permits were retroactively edited to reflect different arrival and departure times. Certain zones were officially marked as visited, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Investigators would later consider these discrepancies crucial, though park officials offered only routine explanations, citing clerical errors. The silence around these changes deepened the sense of an unresolved puzzle. Recovered notebooks contained field observations abruptly interrupted, with some pages missing entirely, leaving cryptic notations behind. The entries were meticulous, detailing bird counts, water quality, and environmental disturbances, sometimes in shorthand or coded abbreviations. Mid-sentence entries stopped, as though the author had been called away suddenly. Pages later found in storage contained repeated observations of trails and signage, but the final hours remained undocumented. These gaps became the core of the enduring enigma, offering tangible proof of presence and the equally tangible absence that followed. Investigators cross-referenced GPS logs and photographic data against the park map, only to discover gaps that defied rational explanation. Certain waypoints were recorded, then skipped, or showed impossible travel speeds across rough terrain. Photos of areas that the journalist could not have reached according to the logs appeared alongside blank timestamps. Even seasoned forensic analysts described the data as disjointed yet precise, a contradiction that suggested neither technological malfunction nor simple human error. The digital trail provided no clarity, only deeper intrigue. Several local researchers recalled seeing the journalist near observation posts that, according to later permits, should have been restricted. They described the figure moving deliberately, taking notes and photographing surroundings. Yet when investigators cross-checked these observations with official access logs, discrepancies emerged. Areas supposedly restricted to the public were photographed, while other zones were entirely unphotographed. These conflicting accounts deepened the mystery, revealing that human oversight, or perhaps intervention, had altered the apparent path of the journalist in ways no field notes alone could resolve. Every documented habit of the journalist, timing, methodical note-taking, and field reporting, suggested they would have left evidence, yet none appeared. Equipment remained, sometimes powered down but otherwise untouched. Cameras and notebooks offered only partial insights, while the GPS device recorded routes that appeared logical in isolation but inconsistent when reconstructed. The meticulous nature of the journalist's work made the absence of a physical trace more inexplicable, emphasizing a dissonance between expectation and reality. The GPS device provided further intrigue. Tracks suggested movements that defied plausible speed for the terrain, with sudden jumps across trails and blank sections of hours-long duration. Some photographic files were partially corrupted, capturing only fragments of locations the journalist claimed to visit. Even the most routine fieldwork seemed caught in an impossible sequence of events. Analysts could not determine whether these anomalies were technical errors, intentional manipulations, or something entirely inexplicable, leaving an unresolved tension between human intention and digital record, a gap no amount of reconstruction could fully bridge. Each reconstructed segment of the journey exposed further contradictions, widening the gap between what was recorded and what had occurred. Areas reportedly visited showed no footprints or signs of passage, while gates supposedly closed remained undisturbed. Field markers noted in notebooks did not always align with locations photographed. Even the most detailed timelines failed to reconcile with observations by park staff, creating an unresolved web of human and administrative uncertainty. Official reports remained frustratingly incomplete, hinting at decisions made beyond public view that left the disappearance unresolved. Authorities issued standard statements, reaffirming the safety protocols and the thoroughness of park regulations. Yet the abrupt removal of certain documents from public access, coupled with retroactive changes to permits, suggested the presence of layers of knowledge withheld or overlooked. These lingering inconsistencies became as central to the story as the disappearance itself, a testament to how human systems can create mysteries as confounding as the wilderness. Within the carefully regulated boundaries of Coley National Park, a journalist vanished entirely, leaving behind only fragmented records and questions that no permit could answer.